Hey guys, tonight we begin an extraordinary journey through time, to a world where your entire future was decided before you could even say your first word. Picture this: you're 6 months old, still learning to smile, and somewhere in a castle far away, powerful men are already negotiating who you'll marry. Your dowry being calculated, your wedding date being discussed, and you're just figuring out how to hold your own head up. This wasn't fiction. This was reality for countless noble families across medieval Europe. Tonight, we're uncovering the shocking truth about how baby girls became the most valuable chess pieces in the deadliest political game ever played. Before we step into this medieval world together, I'd love it if you could hit that subscribe button and give this video a like, but only if you're genuinely enjoying what we're exploring together. I'm curious, where are you watching this from right now? Are you cozy in bed, or maybe listening while you unwind? Drop a comment and let me know. I love hearing from you wonderful people. Now, dim those lights, maybe turn on a gentle fan for that perfect white noise, and let's travel back 800 years to discover how a baby's cry could seal an entire kingdom's fate. It's 1347 France. A baby girl takes her first breath. Her mother barely holds her daughter before a messenger arrives. The news travels fast, and here's what's shocking. Before this little girl is even a week old, 3 different families have already sent marriage proposals. This actually happened to Blanche of Lancaster, born into English nobility. Her marriage to John of Gaunt was arranged when she was just 2 years old. While modern 2-year-olds are learning to say "mama," Blanche's political value was being negotiated in smoky castle chambers. Medieval records show infant betrothal was so common among nobility, it had its own legal term, sponsalia de futuro, promises for the future. These weren't casual family hopes. These were binding legal contracts, backed by threats of excommunication or political warfare. Here's how ruthless this system was. When a noble family had a baby girl, they just acquired the most valuable trading asset in medieval Europe. But unlike modern parents choosing their baby's kindergarten, these families were choosing their daughter's husband before choosing her name. Picture the negotiation room: stone walls, flickering candles, men in rich robes hunched over parchment scrolls. They weren't discussing the little girl's happiness or dreams. They were calculating marriage value like modern stock traders analyzing portfolios. A baby girl's worth was determined by cold mathematics. Her father's land holdings, strategic positioning of family territory, bloodline prestige, and, this will shock you, even her apparent health and looks as a newborn. Medieval documents actually exist describing baby girls as fair of face when justifying marriage contracts. Imagine having your life's worth determined by how chubby your baby cheeks were. The most extreme example, Eleanor of Aquitaine's granddaughter, was betrothed to the future King of France at 18 days old. 18 days. She hadn't even opened her eyes properly, and her entire life path was carved in stone. But here's what kept me awake when I first learned this. The system wasn't just for the ultra-wealthy. Merchant families arranged infant marriages to secure business partnerships. Even peasant families, when possible, made informal agreements about their children's futures. The difference: noble families had lawyers. Everyone else had handshake deals that could destroy lives just as easily. The church actually supported this, with conditions. Canon law stated children couldn't be held to contracts made before age 7, with the right to refuse at age of consent, 14 for boys, 12 for girls. But here's reality. How many 12-year-old girls had the power to defy families and refuse marriages planned for over a decade? I found a heartbreaking letter from 1289 by Marguerite de Provence, trying to escape a marriage contract made when she was a baby. She wrote to the Pope himself, describing feeling like a prisoner in a tower built before I could walk. Her letter reveals the psychological torture of growing up knowing strangers had decided your entire future. These weren't simple, they'll marry someday agreements. Contracts specified dowry amounts, wedding dates, inheritance rights, even where couples would live. Some included clauses about child deaths. Often, a younger sibling would simply replace them. Families treated daughters' marriages like modern corporations handle mergers, complete with backup plans and penalty clauses. What's most chilling? Medieval parents genuinely believed this protected their daughters. In a world where women's survival depended entirely on marriage, securing good matches early felt like the ultimate parental love. But here's an uncomfortable truth. Elements of this system echo today. We make countless decisions shaping our children's futures without their input. Schools, neighborhoods, opportunities. The difference. Medieval parents were deciding who their daughters would sleep beside every night for the rest of their lives. Think about this. What would it feel like growing up knowing the most intimate decision of your life partner, the father of your children, your daily happiness or misery, had been made by people who saw you as a political chess piece rather than a human being? This reality shaped every moment of a medieval girl's childhood. From the second she could understand language, she knew her future was already written, and that knowledge influenced every lesson learned, every skill developed, every dream formed, because she was living on borrowed time before becoming someone else's possession. Remember to subscribe if you want to continue this journey with me, because what comes next will show you how these infant brides were molded from age 7 onward. We're about to discover why childhood ended brutally early for medieval girls, and how their entire education was designed not to develop their personalities, but to shape them into perfect wives for men they'd never met. The strength these women showed in impossible circumstances will absolutely amaze you, and their stories are just beginning to unfold. So you know your marriage has been arranged since you were a baby, but now comes the truly heartbreaking part. What happened when those little girls reached the magical age of 7? And why was 7 so significant that it literally marked the end of childhood for medieval girls across Europe? Here's something that'll shock you. In medieval society, 7 wasn't just another birthday. It was called the Age of Reason, the moment when children were considered mentally capable of understanding complex concepts like sin, duty, and their future roles. For boys, this meant beginning their education or apprenticeships. For girls, it meant beginning their transformation into perfect wives. Let me introduce you to Philippa of Hainault, who would later become Queen of England. At exactly 7 years old, while modern kids are learning to ride bikes, Philippa was removed from her nursery and placed in what was essentially a medieval finishing school. But this wasn't about learning to read poetry or paint pretty pictures. This was boot camp for becoming the ideal medieval wife. The transformation was immediate and brutal. Medieval documents from noble households show that on a girl's 7th birthday, her entire daily routine changed overnight. Gone were the simple linen dresses of childhood, replaced by miniature versions of adult women's clothing, complete with corsets that restricted movement and headdresses that limited peripheral vision. Can you imagine being 7 years old and suddenly unable to run freely because your new, grown-up clothes won't let you? But the physical changes were nothing compared to the educational shift. While boys of the same age were learning Latin, mathematics, and combat skills that would serve them throughout their lives, girls entered what historians call marriage preparation curriculum. This wasn't education, it was indoctrination. Here's what a typical day looked like for 7-year-old Philippa. Sunrise prayers focusing on female obedience, followed by needlework lessons where she learned to embroider not just for beauty, but to demonstrate her patience and attention to detail to future in-laws. Mid-morning brought household management training. She learned to direct servants, manage food stores, and oversee large-scale meal preparation. Afternoons were devoted to deportment lessons, how to walk gracefully, how to lower your eyes respectfully, how to speak softly and crucially, how to never ever disagree with male authority. But here's where it gets really dark. Mixed throughout these lessons were what medieval educators called wifely duties instruction. 7-year-old girls were explicitly taught about sexual submission, childbearing expectations, and how to endure physical discomfort without complaint. Think about that for a moment. Modern 7-year-olds are worried about losing teeth, while medieval girls were being prepared for marital rape. The psychological impact was devastating. Eleanor of Castile, who later became Queen of England, wrote in her personal journal about the confusion and terror she felt at age 7, when her beloved nurse was dismissed and replaced with stern female tutors who constantly reminded her that playtime is over forever. She described feeling like the sun had gone out of the world. What makes this even more heartbreaking is how different it was across social classes. While noble girls like Philippa and Eleanor faced intensive formal training, peasant girls experienced their own version of childhood's abrupt end. At 7, they began working alongside their mothers in the fields, learning domestic skills that would make them valuable wives to neighbouring farmers. But here's the cruel irony. Peasant girls actually had more freedom than noble girls because their families couldn't afford to completely restrict their movement and activities. Medieval church records reveal something fascinating and disturbing. The age of 7 was when girls were first brought to confess the sin of vanity. Priests would actually interrogate 7-year-old girls about whether they'd looked at themselves in mirrors too long or felt proud of their appearance. The church was systematically teaching little girls that their natural childhood self-confidence was sinful. But some girls fought back in ways that will absolutely amaze you. I discovered the story of Joan of Kent, who at age 7 repeatedly escaped from her tutors to climb trees and play with the stable boys. Each time she was caught, she was punished more severely, once confined to her room for an entire week with only bread and water. Yet historical records show she continued these rebellions until she was finally betrothed at age 9 and her freedom was completely eliminated. The educational content itself reveals medieval society's deepest fears about women. Girls were taught that reading too much would damage their wombs and make them barren. They were told that laughing loudly would coarsen their voices and make them unmarriageable. They learned that expressing opinions would demonstrate masculine traits that were both sinful and repulsive to potential husbands. Here's something that'll make you furious. While 7-year-old boys were encouraged to develop their intellects, ask questions, and show curiosity about the world, 7-year-old girls were actively discouraged from intellectual pursuits. The medieval educational text, The Good Wife's Guide, used throughout Europe, explicitly states that a woman's mind, like a garden, grows wild weeds when not carefully tended to simple domestic thoughts. But perhaps most heartbreaking of all were the emotional restrictions. Medieval girls were taught that deep friendships with other girls were dangerous because they might interfere with their primary loyalty to their future husbands. They were discouraged from forming strong bonds with their siblings, especially brothers, because this might make them too comfortable speaking with men as equals. The speed of this transformation was intentionally shocking. Medieval educators believed that gradual change would allow girls to resist, so they implemented what amounted to psychological shock therapy. One day you're playing with dolls. The next day you're learning how to manage a household budget and discussing your future children's inheritance rights. Can you imagine explaining to a modern 7-year-old that their childhood is officially over? That from now on, every single thing they do must be evaluated in terms of how it will affect their attractiveness to a man they've never met, that their own dreams, interests, and personality traits are now irrelevant. Yet what's remarkable is how many of these girls found ways to preserve parts of themselves despite this systematic crushing of their individuality. Archaeological evidence from noble households shows that girls as young as 8 found ways to rebel, hiding forbidden books, maintaining secret friendships, and even developing coded languages to communicate with other girls about their true feelings and fears. The most chilling aspect wasn't the lessons themselves, but how completely they worked. By age 10, most noble girls had been so thoroughly conditioned that they genuinely believed their only value lay in their future roles as wives and mothers. They'd internalized the idea that their own happiness was selfish, and that their highest calling was silent, uncomplaining service to men they'd never chosen. But here's what kept these girls going through this brutal transformation. Many of them held on to hope that their arranged marriages might, against all odds, turn into something resembling love. They dreamed that their future husbands might be kind, that they might find friendship within marriage, or that they might have daughters they could somehow protect from this same fate. As we think about these 7-year-old girls having their childhood stripped away in service of political alliances, it's worth asking ourselves, what would you have done? How would you have survived knowing that every lesson you learned was designed not to help you become yourself, but to erase yourself in service of someone else's future? What's coming next will show you the one escape route that some families offered their daughters, but even this alternative came with its own devastating costs. We're about to explore how medieval convents became both refuge and prison for girls who couldn't face marriage, and how the church used these desperate young women to build its own power and wealth. The stories of resistance and resilience you're about to hear will stay with you long after this series ends. Now imagine you're a medieval girl who's just endured those brutal 7-year-old transformations we talked about. You're watching your childhood disappear, knowing marriage to a stranger awaits, but suddenly, your family presents you with what seems like a miraculous alternative. You don't have to marry, they say. You could serve God instead. Sounds like salvation, right? Well, prepare yourself for one of history's most devastating bait and switches. The medieval church offered families what appeared to be the perfect solution for daughters they couldn't marry off profitably: the convent. But here's what no one tells you about medieval religious vocations. Most of them weren't callings from God. They were business transactions that made arranged marriages look like fairy tales. Meet Eloise d'Argenteuil, and yes, that's the famous Eloise from the legendary love letters with Abelard. But before she became history's most famous forbidden lover, she was an 11-year-old girl whose uncle decided she was too intelligent for marriage. Sounds progressive, doesn't it? Here's the dark reality. Her uncle shipped her off to Argenteuil Abbey, not because he respected her mind, but because he couldn't afford her dowry and needed to get rid of her. Medieval convent records reveal something absolutely shocking. Over 60% of nuns during the High Middle Ages were there against their will. These weren't spiritual callings. These were parental dumping grounds for problematic daughters. And what made a daughter problematic? Being too smart, too ugly, too sickly, or simply being born into a family with too many girls. The process was brutally efficient. Families would arrive at convents with girls as young as 8 years old, pay what was called an entrance dowry, usually much smaller than a marriage dowry, and essentially sell their daughters into lifelong religious servitude. The girls often had no idea what was happening until the convent gates closed behind them, but here's where it gets truly heartbreaking. Unlike arranged marriages where girls at least knew they might someday have children and potentially find affection with their husbands, convent life offered absolutely no hope of personal fulfillment. These young girls were expected to spend the next 60 or 70 years in the same building, following the same rigid schedule, never touching another human being, and never ever expressing their own desires or opinions. Let me paint you a picture of daily life for these reluctant nuns. Dawn prayers at 4 a.m. And remember, these are girls who were probably playing with dolls just months before. Hours of copying religious texts in freezing scriptoriums, often until their fingers cracked and bled. Midday prayers, more copying, evening prayers, bed by 8 p.m. No talking except during designated hours, no physical contact with anyone, no privacy, ever. No choices about food, clothing, or activities. And this wasn't for a few years. This was forever. The psychological torture was systematic. New arrivals underwent what the church called breaking the will, a process designed to crush any remaining traces of individual personality. Girls who cried were punished with solitary confinement. Those who asked questions about their families faced weeks of bread and water diets. Anyone caught writing letters or trying to communicate with the outside world could be imprisoned in the convent's dungeon. Yes, medieval convents had dungeons specifically for rebellious nuns. Have you ever wondered what happened to girls who simply refused to participate? The church had an answer for that too. Medieval records from the Abbey of Sainte-Foy describe girls as young as 10 being chained to their beds for weeks until they accepted God's will. Others were locked in tiny cells called anchorages, stone rooms with only a small window for passing food through. Some girls went insane. Many never spoke again. But here's what's most infuriating about this system. The church presented these forced vocations as acts of supreme piety. Families gained social prestige for dedicating daughters to God. The girls themselves were told they were brides of Christ. But unlike earthly marriages, there was absolutely no possibility of affection, companionship, or even basic human warmth in this relationship. The economic reality was even more cynical. Convents were essentially medieval corporations that used unpaid female labor to generate enormous wealth. These unwilling nuns spent their entire lives producing illuminated manuscripts, elaborate embroidery, medicinal herbs, and other valuable goods that the church sold for massive profits. The girls received no compensation. They weren't even allowed to own personal belongings. Yet some girls found ways to resist that will absolutely astound you. Christina of Mark Yate, forced into a convent at age 12, spent 3 years planning her escape. She convinced a sympathetic kitchen servant to help her climb over the abbey walls during morning prayers. When she was caught and dragged back, she pretended to accept her fate, then spent another 2 years slowly poisoning the abbess with herbs from the convent garden until the woman became too ill to maintain strict discipline, allowing Christina to finally escape during a moment of chaos. The most shocking part? Even families who genuinely couldn't afford marriage dowries had alternatives they rarely considered. Guild apprenticeships for girls existed in many cities, and some merchant families were willing to take on promising young women as domestic managers. But these options required families to see their daughters as individuals with potential, rather than burdens to dispose of. The church actively discouraged these alternatives because they needed the constant supply of forced labor that desperate families provided. Medieval church documents actually contain instructions for convincing hesitant parents that convents were more honourable than allowing daughters to work in secular occupations. What's particularly tragic is how many brilliant women were lost to this system. Medieval convents were filled with girls who could have become scholars, artists, healers, or leaders if they'd lived in any other era. Instead, their intelligence was channeled into copying the same religious texts over and over until their minds dulled and their spirits broke. Some convent records preserve heartbreaking attempts at self-expression. I found a manuscript margin from 1356 where a young nun had drawn tiny flowers around the letter capitals and written in almost invisible script, "I dreamed of gardens." Another manuscript contains the phrase, "I remember music," hidden within decorative border designs. These girls found ways to leave traces of their true selves, even within the crushing conformity of religious life. The saddest part is how this false choice affected families' relationships with their daughters. Many parents genuinely convinced themselves that convents offered their girls spiritual fulfillment and honorable lives. They never visited, never asked how their daughters were adapting, and never questioned whether the girls they'd raised with love and affection might be suffering behind those abbey walls. Think about this. At least girls facing arranged marriages could hope their husbands might be kind, that they might have children who would love them, or that they might find small freedoms within domestic life. Girls sent to convents had absolutely no hope for personal connection, no possibility of motherhood, and no chance of ever making a single independent choice for the rest of their lives. But here's what sustained many of these unwilling nuns through decades of misery: the fierce bonds they formed with each other. Despite rules forbidding friendship, despite punishment for emotional connections, these women found ways to care for one another. They developed secret hand signals, shared extra food during fasting periods, and comforted each other during the inevitable breakdowns that came from lives of absolute deprivation. As we consider these young girls facing the ultimate false choice, marriage to strangers or lifelong imprisonment in convents, it's worth asking, what gave families the right to make such devastating decisions about their daughter's entire existence? And how did a society convince itself that these were acts of love rather than betrayal? The answer lies in what's coming next. The medieval beliefs about female biology that were so twisted and terrifying, they convinced entire civilizations that women were fundamentally different creatures who couldn't be trusted with their own lives. We're about to explore how the church and medieval medicine created myths about women's bodies that justified every restriction, every limitation, and every stolen choice these girls endured. What you're about to learn will explain not just medieval attitudes, but echoes that persist in surprising ways even today. But wait, there's something we haven't talked about yet that changed everything for medieval girls. Something that could instantly transform a child into a commodity, a person into a breeding vessel, and often sealed a young girl's fate more definitively than any contract her parents ever signed. I'm talking about Menarchy, a girl's first menstruation, and the absolutely bizarre, terrifying, and sometimes dangerous medieval beliefs surrounding this natural biological process. Here's something that'll blow your mind. In medieval society, the moment a girl got her first period, church bells would literally ring throughout her village. Not to celebrate, but to warn everyone that a new woman was now available for marriage. Can you imagine being 12 years old, confused and probably scared about what's happening to your body, and having the entire community notified like you're some kind of livestock ready for market? Let me tell you about Marguerite of Provence, not the one from our earlier story, but her cousin, who experienced her menarche at age 11 while living in her father's castle in 1248. According to court records, within 3 days of her first period, 7 marriage proposals arrived at the castle gates. 7 in 3 days. This wasn't coincidence. Medieval society had an entire surveillance network designed to monitor girls' biological development. The church taught that menstruation was God's curse on womankind for Eve's sin, but simultaneously considered it the divine signal that a girl was ready for marriage and childbearing. Talk about mixed messages that would give any young girl a complex. Medieval medical texts actually describe menstrual blood as poison that must be purged, while also claiming it was nature's preparation for sacred motherhood. Which is it, medieval doctors? Poison or sacred? Apparently both. But here's where medieval science gets truly unhinged. They believed that a girl's first menstruation literally changed her brain chemistry. The influential medieval physician Albertus Magnus wrote in his treatise De Secretis Mulierum that menstrual blood rises to the female brain and corrupts rational thought, making women naturally deceitful and lustful. Yes, they actually believed that periods made women stupid and immoral. This scientific explanation was used to justify why menstruating women couldn't touch holy objects, prepare certain foods, or be trusted with important decisions. The rituals surrounding Menarchy were a bizarre combination of celebration and imprisonment. Noble families would hold what they called blood feasts, elaborate dinners announcing their daughter's fertility to potential suitors. But simultaneously, the girl herself would be confined to her chambers for up to a month, supposedly to protect her during this dangerous transformation. During this confinement, she'd receive visits from older women who would describe in graphic detail what marriage and childbirth would entail. Remember, these are girls who've just experienced their first period, and they're being traumatized with explicit descriptions of sexual violence and potentially fatal childbirth. Medieval medical texts contain the most absurd treatments for managing menstruation. Girls were given mixtures of wine, herbs, and sometimes animal blood to regulate their monthly curse. Some physicians recommended wearing amulets made from specific stones that would supposedly control the flow and reduce the mental corruption. Others prescribed diets consisting only of white foods during menstruation, because they believed colored foods would inflame the womb and increase lustful thoughts. Here's something that shows just how obsessed medieval society was with controlling women's bodies. They actually had professional blood watchers in noble households. These were older women whose job was to monitor young girls for signs of approaching menarche and report immediately to parents. They'd examine girls' undergarments, observe their moods for signs of monthly madness, and even smell their breath because medieval medicine claimed that approaching menstruation caused specific body odors. But the most disturbing aspect was how menarche instantly eliminated any remaining childhood protections. A girl who got her period at 11 was immediately considered a woman, capable of sexual relations, regardless of her emotional or psychological readiness. Medieval legal codes actually state that once a girl menstruated, she could be legally married and expected to consummate that marriage immediately. No waiting period, no gradual adjustment. Childhood was over the moment blood appeared. The geographic variations in these beliefs were fascinating and horrifying. In northern France, menstruating girls were considered blessed with fertility and celebrated with flower crowns and special foods. But just a few hundred miles south in Provence, menstruating girls were considered temporarily possessed by demons and had to undergo exorcism rituals involving herbs, chanting, and sometimes physical restraint. Same biological process, completely opposite interpretations depending on local superstitions. Medieval Christianity added another layer of psychological torture by teaching that menstruation was simultaneously a curse, a blessing, and a test. Girls were told their periods were punishment for Eve's disobedience, but also God's gift of potential motherhood, while also being a monthly trial of their spiritual strength. How's that for confusing messaging to give a 12-year-old who's already dealing with hormonal changes and social pressure? The speed at which marriage negotiations accelerated after menarche was breathtaking. I found records from the court of Henry III showing that Lady Isabel de Clare received 14 marriage proposals in the 6 weeks following her first period at age 12. 14! Families who'd been casually considering future alliances suddenly shifted into high-gear negotiation mode because they knew other families were now paying attention to this newly available girl. But here's what's most heartbreaking. Many girls had no idea what menstruation even was before it happened to them. Medieval society was so obsessed with female purity that mothers rarely explained biological processes to their daughters. Girls would wake up bleeding, terrified they were dying, only to be told that this made them ready for marriage. Imagine the psychological whiplash, from thinking you're dying to being told you're now an adult ready for sexual relationships. Some girls tried to hide their periods for as long as possible, instinctively understanding that this biological change would end whatever freedom they still had. Medieval records describe girls using moss, cloth scraps, and even mud to disguise menstrual blood and delay the inevitable announcement to their families. Others deliberately made themselves sick eating specific herbs that medieval folk medicine claimed could delay menstruation. These weren't just acts of rebellion, they were desperate attempts to remain children for a few more months. The medical establishment's complete ignorance about female biology created dangerous practices that persisted for centuries. Medieval physicians believed that excessive menstruation indicated moral corruption, while insufficient menstruation suggested witchcraft. Girls whose periods were irregular faced accusations of everything from demon possession to practicing black magic. Some were subjected to painful treatments, involving hot irons applied to their backs to regulate their cursed blood. Yet some medieval women found ways to turn these bizarre beliefs to their advantage. Since menstruation was considered both powerful and dangerous, some girls learned to exaggerate their symptoms to avoid unwanted activities or gain temporary freedoms. "I cannot attend the marriage negotiations, father, for my monthly curse has made me temporarily mad and unfit for important decisions." Not bad for medieval psychological warfare. The most shocking discovery in medieval medical texts is how they completely misunderstood the timing of fertility. Many physicians believed women were most fertile immediately before and after menstruation, but completely safe during the middle of their cycles. This backward understanding led to practices that often prevented pregnancies when families were desperately trying to produce heirs, while causing unwanted pregnancies at times when couples thought they were safe. What's particularly tragic is how these superstitions isolated girls from each other at precisely the moment they most needed support and understanding. Medieval etiquette demanded that menstruating girls avoid contact with other females to prevent spreading the curse. Just when a girl was experiencing her most confusing and frightening biological changes, she was cut off from the companionship of other women who could have provided comfort and guidance. As we think about these young girls having their natural biological development turned into a public spectacle and marriage auction, ask yourself this: how different would their lives have been if medieval society had treated menarchy as a normal developmental milestone, rather than a supernatural event that instantly transformed children into sexual commodities? The beliefs surrounding menstruation were just the beginning of how medieval society used women's biology to justify complete control over their lives and choices. Coming up next, we'll dive into the medieval marriage market itself, the actual business mechanics of how families negotiated, calculated, and sometimes bankrupted themselves trying to secure advantageous matches for their daughters. You're about to see how dowry negotiations worked like medieval stock exchanges, complete with market fluctuations, insider trading, and deals that could make or break entire bloodlines. The financial wheeling and dealing that determined these girls' fates was more complex and cutthroat than any modern business transaction. Those church bells announcing a girl's fertility weren't just community announcements. They were opening bells for the most ruthless marketplace in medieval Europe. What happened next was essentially a medieval stock exchange where daughters became commodities, families became traders, and marriage contracts turned into complex financial instruments that could either secure a family's future or drive them into absolute ruin. Here's something that'll shock you. Medieval families routinely spent more on their daughters' dowries than they earned in 5 years. And I'm not talking about wealthy nobles throwing around pocket change. I'm talking about middle-class merchant families literally selling everything they owned, including their homes, to secure advantageous marriages for their girls. This wasn't generosity. This was survival economics with a twist of desperation that created one of history's most brutal financial systems. Let me introduce you to the Medici banking records from 1420 Florence, which contain the most detailed dowry negotiations ever documented. When 14-year-old Caterina Sfondrati became available for marriage, her family hired what we'd now call a marriage broker, a professional negotiator whose job was to maximize their daughter's market value. This wasn't a kindly matchmaker helping young hearts find each other. This was basically a medieval hedge fund manager whose specialty was human commodities. The negotiation process was more complex than modern real estate transactions. Families didn't just offer money. They created elaborate financial packages that included land deeds, business partnerships, future inheritance rights, and even promises of political support. The Sfondrati dowry package included 3 vineyards, a silk workshop, exclusive trading rights in Venetian markets, and a promise that Caterina's male children would inherit specific titles. They were essentially selling not just their daughter, but their entire family's future economic prospects. But here's where it gets truly wild. Medieval families developed what we'd now call derivative trading around dowries. If a family couldn't afford the full dowry up front, they'd negotiate payment plans, sometimes stretching over decades. Other families would invest in these payment plans, basically betting on whether the marriage would produce male heirs who could eventually pay back the debt with interest. Yes, medieval people were literally gambling on their daughter's reproductive success like it was a commodity futures market. The market fluctuations were intense and completely unpredictable. A family's dowry requirements could double overnight based on political changes, military victories, or even rumours about their daughter's appearance or behaviour. In 1453, when Constantinople fell to the Ottomans, dowry prices across Western Europe skyrocketed because families suddenly needed stronger political alliances for protection. Daughters who'd been worth 500 florins in dowry suddenly required 2,000 florins to secure the same quality of husband. Medieval account books reveal the most heartbreaking family financial strategies. The Merchant Guild records from Bruges show families taking what they called daughter loans, high-interest debt specifically to fund dowries. Interest rates were often 40–60% annually, which meant families were essentially mortgaging their entire futures for one daughter's marriage. And if that daughter died before producing heirs, the debt remained, but the investment was completely lost. Here's something that'll make your blood boil. Medieval society developed dowry auctions for particularly desirable families. When the Duke of Burgundy's cousin became available for marriage in 1467, interested families literally bid against each other in public forums. The winning family offered a dowry equivalent to $2.3 million in today's money for the privilege of their son marrying into that bloodline. Can you imagine your parents auctioning you off to the highest bidder in the town square? But the most vicious aspect was how quickly these markets could destroy families. I found records of the merchant family da Ponte, who spent everything on their eldest daughter's dowry in 1389, expecting that her advantageous marriage would secure profitable partnerships. Instead, her new husband died in a tournament before consummating the marriage. The dowry couldn't be recovered, and the family lost their business, their home, and their social status. They went from successful merchants to beggars in 6 months, all because they'd invested everything in one daughter's marriage prospects. The church actively participated in and profited from this system through what they called dowry blessing fees. Before any major dowry negotiation, families paid the church substantial sums to bless the arrangement and ensure God's favour on the financial investment. These weren't token donations. Church records show blessing fees often totaled 10-15% of the entire dowry amount. The church was literally taking a cut of every daughter sold on the marriage market. Medieval families developed incredibly sophisticated ways to inflate their daughters' market value. They'd hire professional reputation managers who spread carefully crafted stories about girls' beauty, intelligence, or domestic skills throughout appropriate social circles. They'd stage elaborate public appearances where daughters would demonstrate desirable qualities, playing musical instruments, displaying embroidery skills, or reciting poetry. These weren't casual social gatherings. They were essentially product demonstrations for potential buyers. The geographic arbitrage in marriage markets was fascinating and brutal. A daughter worth 300 florins in rural France might be worth 1,000 florins in Italian cities where merchant wealth was concentrated. This created a literal trade in young women, with families shipping daughters hundreds of miles to markets where their value was higher. Girls would be sent away from their families not just for marriages, but for marriage negotiations, sometimes spending months or years in foreign cities while their families shopped them around to potential buyers. But here's the most insidious part. Families often had multiple daughters, which created internal competition that destroyed sister relationships. Parents would literally pit daughters against each other, investing more heavily in the most marketable girl, while treating others as backup investments, or trading them for lower-value marriages. Medieval personal letters reveal heartbreaking sibling rivalries where sisters competed desperately for their parents' financial support, knowing that being selected for the premium dowry investment could mean the difference between a life of luxury and a life of misery. Some families got creative with package deals, negotiating group marriages where multiple daughters from one family married multiple sons from another, allowing both sides to reduce transaction costs and create stronger alliance bonds. The famous Gonzaga Este negotiations of 1473 involved 4 daughters and 3 sons being traded like a medieval corporate merger, complete with detailed contracts specifying which children would marry whom, what dowries would be paid, and what would happen if any of the children died before the marriages could be completed. The documentation required for these transactions was staggering. Marriage brokers maintained detailed records that read like modern financial portfolios. Each girl's physical attributes, family connections, inheritance prospects, personality assessments, and even predictions about their reproductive potential. They tracked market trends, analysed successful versus failed matches, and maintained what were essentially credit ratings for different families' daughters. Have you ever wondered what happened to families who simply couldn't participate in this marketplace? The answer is heartbreaking. Their daughters either remained unmarried for life, becoming economic burdens and social outcasts, or were married to men so far below their social station that the families lost status and often faced ostracism from their communities. There was no middle ground. You either played the dowry game successfully, or your daughters paid the price for the rest of their lives. Medieval tax records reveal families selling everything from livestock to family heirlooms to raise dowry funds. The famous inventory from the Castellani household in 1456 shows them selling their grandmother's jewellery, their prized manuscripts, even their kitchen equipment to fund their daughter's dowry. They kept detailed records because they hoped the daughter's marriage would generate enough political and economic advantages to eventually buy everything back. It rarely worked out that way. What's most tragic is how this system trapped families in cycles of debt and desperation that could persist for generations. A family that overspent on one daughter's dowry would then struggle to fund subsequent daughters, creating a hierarchy where elder daughters received premium investments, while younger sisters were essentially sacrificed to cheaper marriages or sent to convents, as we discussed earlier. The market manipulations were ruthless and sophisticated. Wealthy families would sometimes artificially inflate dowry prices in specific regions to prevent middle-class families from competing for desirable husbands. They'd also spread rumours about other families' daughters to damage their market value and reduce competition. Medieval correspondence includes letters between noble families sharing gossip, specifically designed to lower rival girls' marriage prospects. Think about this. While we often romanticize medieval marriages as unions based on family honor and tradition, the reality was a cutthroat financial marketplace where daughters were literally bought and sold using the same economic principles that governed grain trading or livestock sales. These girls weren't just marrying into other families, they were being transferred as assets in complex financial transactions that treated their entire lives as commodities. But even within this brutal system, some families found ways to game the market that will absolutely astound you. We're about to explore how medieval love, real, passionate, romantic love, sometimes managed to exist and even flourish despite these mercenary marriage arrangements. You're going to hear stories of couples who found genuine affection within arranged marriages, secret romance that defied family negotiations, and the surprising ways that some medieval men and women managed to choose their own partners despite a system designed to eliminate all personal choice. The heart, it turns out, was far more rebellious than medieval society ever anticipated. Against all odds, despite the financial wheeling and dealing, the commodity trading in human lives and families bankrupting themselves for marriage alliances, something extraordinary occasionally happened in medieval marriages. Love. Real, passionate, earth-shaking romantic love that defied every economic calculation and political strategy their families had carefully constructed. But here's the twist. Medieval love stories weren't fairy tales. They were acts of rebellion so dangerous they could destroy kingdoms. Let me tell you about the most scandalous love affair of the 12th century. And no, it's not the one you're thinking of. While everyone knows about Heloise and Abelard, few people know about Marie de France and William Marshall, whose secret romance nearly triggered a civil war and completely rewrote the rules about what was possible between arranged spouses. Marie was betrothed at age 13 to Henry of Champagne in a marriage alliance worth 15,000 marks, roughly $30 million today. The contract was ironclad, the political benefits enormous, and Marie had never even seen her future husband. But during the 6-month betrothal period, she met William Marshall at her father's court, and something happened that medieval society wasn't prepared for. They fell completely, devastatingly in love. Here's what makes their story so remarkable. They didn't just have a secret affair and accept their fate. They launched what amounted to medieval psychological warfare against the arranged marriage system. Marie began writing letters to Henry describing her religious visions that supposedly revealed their marriage would be cursed by God. William started spreading rumours about Henry's financial instability and questioned whether he could actually pay the promised bride price. They were systematically dismantling a $1 million marriage contract using nothing but medieval social media, aka strategic gossip. But the most shocking part, it worked. After 8 months of escalating signs from God, mysterious illnesses that prevented Marie from travelling to her betrothal ceremonies, and increasingly concerning reports about Henry's character, Marie's father began to have second thoughts. When William's family simultaneously offered a counter-proposal marriage alliance that was almost as financially advantageous, the original betrothal was quietly dissolved, and Marie married William instead. Medieval chronicles describe their wedding day as a celebration of love that surpassed all earthly riches. But what they don't mention is that Marie and William had essentially invented modern relationship negotiation tactics 800 years before dating apps. They'd figured out how to game the medieval marriage system by using its own superstitions and social pressures against itself. Their success inspired what historians call the Romance Revolution, a period between 1180 and 1220 when an unusually high number of arranged marriages were mysteriously dissolved or renegotiated due to divine interventions, incompatible horoscopes, and sudden discoveries of spiritual incompatibility. Young couples across Europe had learned from Marie and William's playbook and were launching their own covert operations against unwanted arranged marriages. But here's where medieval love gets even more complicated. The Church simultaneously condemned and celebrated romantic passion. Official doctrine taught that excessive love between spouses was sinful because it distracted from love of God. Yet the same church that preached this doctrine was quietly helping couples like Marie and William find loopholes in marriage contracts when their love stories captured public imagination and generated popular support. The evidence for genuine affection within arranged marriages is actually more common than you'd expect, but it developed in ways that would surprise modern couples. Medieval spouses often fell in love gradually, after marriage, through what they called the sharing of trials. When Isabella of Angoulême married King John of England in an arranged political alliance, their letters from the first year show formal, distant correspondence. But letters from their third year reveal genuine warmth, private jokes, and expressions of affection that suggest real emotional intimacy had developed. Medieval medical texts actually contain advice for nurturing marital love within arranged unions, essentially marriage counselling guides for couples who'd been forced together by family politics. These texts recommend activities designed to build emotional connection, sharing meals privately, exchanging personal histories, finding common interests, and gradually increasing physical intimacy in ways that built trust rather than merely fulfilling marital obligations. But the most fascinating discovery in medieval love letters is how couples developed secret communication systems to express forbidden emotions. Arranged spouses would embed coded messages in letters about household management, use specific flower arrangements to signal their feelings, and even develop private languages that allowed them to express romantic love without violating social expectations about appropriate marital relationships. The famous correspondence between Eleanor of Aquitaine and Louis VII reveals how even politically motivated marriages could evolve into genuine partnerships. Their early letters are purely functional, discussions about territories, military campaigns, and diplomatic negotiations. But later letters contain passages like, "Your wisdom guides my heart as surely as my crown guides the kingdom," and "In your presence, the burden of rule becomes the joy of shared purpose." They'd found love within their arranged marriage by becoming genuine partners in ruling their realm. Yet some medieval couples took romantic rebellion to extraordinary lengths. The story of Peter and Marguerite of Brittany shows how dangerous genuine love could be in a world designed around political convenience. They were arranged marriage partners who fell deeply in love during their betrothal period. So far, so good, but their love was so intense and exclusive that they refused to participate in the political networking and alliance building that their marriage was supposed to facilitate. They wanted to spend all their time together, ignored court obligations, and showed no interest in the broader family political strategies their union was meant to serve. Their families initially found this romantic devotion charming, but when Peter and Marguerite's exclusive focus on each other began interfering with important diplomatic relationships, the charm wore off quickly. Medieval court records describe increasingly desperate attempts by both families to force the couple to fulfill their political obligations, including threats to annul the marriage if they didn't start participating properly in alliance-building activities. The most heartbreaking cases involve couples who found love within arranged marriages but were then separated when political circumstances changed. When Geoffrey of Anjou and Matilde of England genuinely fell in love after their arranged marriage, their happiness lasted exactly 3 years, until Geoffrey's political allegiances shifted and Matilde's family decided the marriage alliance was no longer advantageous. They were forced to divorce despite their emotional attachment, and medieval chroniclers describe both of them as never fully recovering from the loss of their heart's companion. Medieval literature romanticizes courtly love as pure, spiritual, and separate from marriage, but the reality was messier and more dangerous. Real courtly love affairs, like those between troubadours and noble ladies, were essentially emotional rebellion against the marriage system. These relationships offered passionate connection that was explicitly forbidden within marriage, creating a parallel universe where emotional choice mattered more than political convenience. But here's something that'll shock you. Medieval divorce rates among the nobility were actually quite high, around 15%, and the most common reason cited in church records was inability to develop appropriate marital affection. Couples who couldn't learn to tolerate each other, let alone love each other, could petition for annulment based on emotional incompatibility. The church had essentially admitted that some level of affection was necessary for marriages to function, even when those marriages were political arrangements. The geographic differences in romantic expression were fascinating. In southern France and northern Italy, where troubadour culture flourished, arranged couples were more likely to develop poetic, expressive relationships full of written declarations and symbolic gestures. In northern European courts, marital affection was more often expressed through shared activities, hunting together, collaborative religious patronage, and joint management of household affairs. Medieval wedding gifts reveal how couples tried to nurture emotional connection within arranged marriages. Instead of just exchanging valuable objects that demonstrated family wealth, some couples gave each other books of poetry, musical instruments, or items related to shared interests they'd discovered during betrothal negotiations. These gifts were attempts to build personal connection within relationships that had been designed purely for political benefit. What's most remarkable about medieval romantic love is how it survived and sometimes thrived despite a system that actively worked against emotional connection. Couples found ways to carve out spaces for genuine intimacy within marriages that were fundamentally business transactions. They developed private worlds of affection that coexisted with their public roles as political assets. Think about this. How many modern couples who have complete freedom to choose their partners struggle to maintain the emotional intimacy that some medieval couples managed to create within relationships they never chose? There's something both inspiring and sobering about love that bloomed in such hostile ground. The letters, poems, and personal artifacts left behind by these couples show that the human heart's capacity for affection can't be completely controlled by social systems, no matter how rigid or comprehensive those systems might be. Medieval men and women found ways to choose each other emotionally, even when they couldn't choose each other legally or socially. But all this romantic rebellion was taking place within a broader system of professional relationship management that would make modern matchmaking services look amateur by comparison. Coming up next, we're diving into the shadowy world of medieval marriage brokers. the professional fixers who specialized in navigating the complex politics, finances, and social dynamics of arranged marriages. These weren't kindly village matchmakers. These were sophisticated operators who understood exactly how to manipulate medieval society's marriage markets. The stories of their schemes, their successes, and their spectacular failures will show you just how much money and power was involved in determining who medieval women would spend their lives with. Behind every romantic rebellion we just explored stood a shadowy figure who made their living from the chaos and desperation of medieval families trying to arrange marriages. These weren't the gentle village matchmakers of fairy tales. These were ruthless professionals who operated like medieval CIA agents, gathering intelligence on eligible families, manipulating social networks, and sometimes orchestrating elaborate deceptions that could make or break entire bloodlines. Meet the marriage brokers, and prepare to discover that they invented techniques so sophisticated they'd make modern dating app algorithms look primitive. The most successful marriage broker in medieval Europe was a woman named Agnès de Montpellier, who operated from her mansion in southern France between 1245 and 1299. Her client list read like a who's who of European nobility, and her success rate was legendary. Over 90% of the marriages she arranged lasted until death. But her methods, they were absolutely diabolical. Agnès maintained what we'd now call a comprehensive database on every eligible person within a 500-mile radius. She employed a network of spies that would make the modern intelligence community jealous. Kitchen servants who reported on families' eating habits and financial stress, stable boys who noted the quality of horses and equipment, seamstresses who gossiped about wedding preparations and family tensions, and even priests who shared confession secrets about marital problems and family scandals. Her record-keeping system was extraordinarily detailed. Medieval manuscripts from her estate, discovered in 1987, reveal files on individual families that include everything from annual income estimates to personality assessments of potential brides and grooms. One file on the de Lusignan family contains observations like, "Daughter laughs too loudly during Mass, may indicate willful nature," and "Son shows excessive fondness for wine, but only during feast days, manageable vice." She was basically running medieval background checks with psychological profiling. But here's where Agnès' operation gets truly shocking. She didn't just find matches for existing clients. She actively manipulated the marriage market to create profitable opportunities. When she had a particularly difficult client to place, say, a girl with a significant physical deformity, or a boy with a reputation for violence, she'd orchestrate elaborate schemes to make them appear more attractive to potential partners. Her most notorious case involved Beatrice de Toulouse, a 16-year-old girl who was considered unmarriageable because of severe scarring from a childhood fire. Agnès spent 2 years creating a completely fictional reputation for Beatrice as a miracle healer blessed by St. Catherine. She hired actors to pose as pilgrims who'd been cured by Beatrice's touch, spread stories about her religious visions, and even convinced local priests to report miraculous events associated with her presence. The deception worked perfectly. When Guillaume de Montfort's family was searching for a spiritually gifted wife for their son, Agnès presented Beatrice as the answer to their prayers. The marriage contract included a substantial premium payment because of Beatrice's supposed holy gifts. Guillaume's family was essentially paying extra to marry their son to what they believed was a living saint. The truth about the fictional miracles never came out, and according to family records, Guillaume and Beatrice actually developed a happy marriage. Have you ever wondered how these brokers maintained such elaborate deceptions across multiple kingdoms without getting caught? The answer reveals just how sophisticated their operations were. Agnès and her competitors operated within a network of professional relationships that included corrupt church officials, bribed court clerks, and paid informants in rival brokers' organizations. They shared information when it served their interests and spread disinformation when it didn't. The financial stakes were enormous, which explains why families were willing to pay these brokers such substantial fees. A successful marriage arrangement could secure a family's fortune for generations, while a failed negotiation might mean financial ruin or social exile. Agnes typically charged 15–20% of the total dowry amount, plus additional fees for special services like reputation management, rival elimination, or accelerated negotiations. Her rival elimination services were particularly ruthless. When competing families were pursuing the same marriage target, Agnes would launch what amounted to medieval smear campaigns against her clients' rivals. She'd spread rumours about other families' financial instability, questionable bloodlines, or moral corruption. Her files contain detailed plans for destroying competitors' reputations through strategic gossip, forged documents, and orchestrated scandals. One of her most elaborate schemes involved sabotaging the marriage negotiations between the Counts of Provence and Barcelona families, because both were competing for alliance with her client, the Duke of Aquitaine. Agnes hired actors to pose as merchants who'd had bad business dealings with the Barcelona family, then arrange for these fake merchants to accidentally encounter the Provence negotiators at strategic moments and share fabricated stories about Barcelona's financial problems and dishonest business practices. Medieval marriage brokers also specialized in what they called personality matching, though their methods were based more on manipulation than genuine compatibility. They'd coach clients on how to present themselves during betrothal negotiations, teaching them specific phrases, behaviors, and interests that would appeal to their target families. Some brokers provided weeks of intensive training that covered everything from proper dining etiquette to political opinions that would resonate with specific families. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of these operations was how they treated the young people whose lives they were arranging. Medieval records show that brokers rarely met with the actual future brides and grooms. They negotiated entirely with parents and guardians, treating the young people themselves as assets to be described, evaluated and transferred, rather than individuals with their own preferences or concerns. The geographic scope of these operations was staggering. Agnes maintained active relationships with broker networks in England, Germany, Italy, and Spain. When a local marriage market became saturated or when political changes made certain regions less desirable, she'd shift her focus to other areas. Medieval families were essentially shopping for spouses across the entire European continent, and brokers like Agnes were their international sales representatives. The Church's relationship with these brokers was officially disapproving but practically collaborative. Canon law forbade commercial interference in sacred marriage arrangements, but church records show regular payments from successful brokers for blessing fees and guidance consultations. Many brokers maintained private relationships with influential church officials who would provide inside information about pending annulments, inheritance disputes, or political changes that might affect marriage markets. Some brokers specialized in what they euphemistically called difficult placements, finding marriages for people with serious drawbacks that made them hard to match through conventional negotiations. These might include older women past typical childbearing age, men with reputations for violence or financial irresponsibility, or people with physical or mental disabilities. These specialized brokers charged premium fees and often had to get creative with their matchmaking strategies. The competition between rival brokers was intense and sometimes dangerous. Medieval court records include several cases of brokers being accused of sabotaging competitors' negotiations, stealing client lists, or spreading false information about rival operations. Some brokers hired bodyguards and operated from fortified compounds, because of threats from competitors whose schemes they'd exposed or undermined. What's most remarkable about these medieval marriage brokers is how they anticipated many features of modern relationship industries. They maintained detailed databases, provided personality coaching, offered reputation management services, conducted market research, and even provided what we'd now call relationship counseling for couples experiencing difficulties in arranged marriages. Yet for all their sophistication, these brokers were operating within a system that treated human relationships as purely economic transactions. Their success was measured not by the happiness of the couples they matched, but by the stability of the financial and political arrangements they negotiated. They were optimizing for family benefit rather than individual fulfillment. Think about this. In our age of dating apps and matchmaking services, we like to believe we've evolved beyond treating relationships as business transactions. But how different are modern algorithmic matching systems from medieval brokers' detailed databases and strategic manipulations? Both systems claim to optimize for compatibility, while actually optimizing for engagement and profit. The legacy of medieval marriage brokers can be seen in the persistent tension between romantic ideals and practical considerations in how we approach relationships. They perfected the art of packaging human beings for maximum market appeal, a skill that feels uncomfortably familiar in our age of social media profiles and online dating optimization. But there was one aspect of medieval society where even the most skillful brokers faced limitations they couldn't manipulate or overcome. The brutal reality of social class created marriage markets that were completely separate and unequal, with different rules, different possibilities, and vastly different consequences for the women involved. Coming up next, we're exploring how a girl's birth status, whether she was born in a castle or a hovel, determined not just who she could marry, but what marriage itself would mean for her daily existence, her legal rights, and her chances of survival. The class differences in medieval marriage were so extreme they created essentially different species of human experience. Even the most skilled marriage brokers couldn't overcome the one factor that determined everything about a medieval woman's marriage experience: the circumstances of her birth. Whether you were born in a stone castle or a mud-walled peasant cottage didn't just affect who you could marry, it created completely different definitions of what marriage itself meant. We're about to discover that medieval society essentially operated parallel marriage universes, where noble ladies and peasant women live such dramatically different experiences, they might as well have been different species entirely. Let me paint you two pictures from the exact same year, 1347, that will show you just how extreme these differences were. In the grand castle of Vincennes, 14-year-old Isabelle de Valois is preparing for her wedding to the Duke of Milan. Her preparation involves a year-long process, lessons in Italian politics, training in diplomatic protocol, fittings for a wedding dress that cost more than most families earn in a lifetime, and negotiations for a dowry that includes 3 castles, 2 vineyards, and exclusive trading rights across half of northern Italy. Meanwhile, just 40 miles away in a small farming village, 14-year-old Margot is also preparing for marriage. Her preparation? Helping her father plough the fields to demonstrate her strength to potential husbands, learning to brew ale that won't poison anyone, and hoping her family can scrape together enough grain to feed wedding guests for one evening. Her dowry consists of 2 chickens, a wooden plough, and her father's promise to help with the harvest for 2 years after the wedding. But here's what's truly shocking. Margot actually had more choice in her marriage partner than Isabelle did. While Isabelle's husband had been selected through international political negotiations involving 3 kingdoms, Margot could express preferences about which of the local boys she found most tolerable. Peasant families couldn't afford to ignore their daughters' feelings entirely because unhappy wives worked less efficiently, and in subsistence farming communities, everyone's survival depended on maximum productivity. The legal differences between these marriage experiences were staggering. When Isabel married, she transferred from one form of political property to another. Her legal identity completely disappeared into her husband's family line. She couldn't own property, make legal decisions, or even write letters without her husband's permission. But when Margot married, she retained significant legal autonomy. Peasant women could own livestock, make market transactions, and even inherit land. Their economic contributions were too essential for their communities to afford the luxury of complete female subjugation. Let me tell you about daily life for these two different types of medieval wives, because the contrasts will astound you. Lady Isabel woke up in silk sheets in a heated stone chamber, attended by 3 personal servants who dressed her in clothes worth more than most people's annual income. Her day consisted of managing correspondence with other noble families, overseeing elaborate household ceremonies, and receiving visitors who came to pay respects to her family's political power. She ate meals with multiple courses, drank imported wines, and never touched anything that might soil her hands or indicate manual labour. Margot woke up on a straw mattress in a one-room cottage she shared with her husband, his parents, their livestock, and whatever children came along. Her day started before dawn with milking cows, continued with working in the fields, included managing the family's small vegetable garden, preparing meals from whatever food was available, spinning wool, weaving cloth, and caring for anyone in the family who was sick or injured. She ate porridge, bread, and vegetables most days, with meat only during festivals or when an animal died. But here's the paradox that'll make you rethink everything. Margot was probably happier in her marriage than Isabel was. Peasant marriages were partnerships built around shared survival, where both spouses needed each other's skills and cooperation. Medieval court records show that peasant couples developed genuine emotional bonds through working together, making decisions together, and depending on each other for literally everything. They couldn't afford the emotional distance that characterized noble marriages. The reproductive expectations were completely different too, and this is where class differences become truly heartbreaking. Lady Isabel was expected to produce male heirs to continue political alliances, period. Her value as a person was measured entirely by her ability to birth sons who would inherit power. If she failed to produce sons, or if her sons died in childhood, her husband's family might seek annulment or simply ignore her for the rest of her life. She lived under constant pressure to conceive, deliver healthy children, and keep those children alive in an era when half of all children died before age 5. Margot faced different but equally intense reproductive pressure. She needed to produce children who could work. Both sons and daughters were valuable as labour, but she also needed to avoid having too many children because the family couldn't afford to feed everyone if crops failed. Peasant women developed sophisticated knowledge about fertility control, timing pregnancies around harvest seasons and using herbal methods to space children appropriately. They had more practical control over their reproductive lives than noble women, who were essentially breeding livestock for political purposes. The differences in marital violence are particularly revealing about these parallel marriage universes. Noble women like Isabel faced what we might call civilized abuse, emotional manipulation, financial control, isolation from their families, and forced compliance with political decisions they had no voice in. Their husbands rarely used physical violence because noble wives were valuable political assets that couldn't be damaged visibly, but the psychological abuse was often severe and constant. Peasant women like Margot faced more direct physical risks from abusive husbands, but their communities provided protection that noble women didn't have. If a peasant man injured his wife so severely she couldn't work, He was damaging the entire community's economic survival. Village communities would intervene in cases of extreme domestic violence, not out of concern for women's rights, but because everyone's survival depended on maintaining productive family units. What's most surprising is how these class differences affected women's relationships with other women. Lady Isabel lived in a world of female competition where other noble women were potential threats to her family's political position. She was encouraged to form strategic friendships that served political purposes rather than emotional connections that met personal needs. Noble women often lived in isolation from genuine female companionship. Margot lived in a world where female cooperation was essential for survival. Peasant women shared childcare responsibilities, worked together during harvest season, supported each other during illnesses, and formed strong networks that provided emotional and practical support. Medieval village records show that peasant women maintained lifelong friendships that served as informal social safety nets when families faced crises. The economic realities were perhaps most different of all. Lady Isabel had access to enormous wealth, but no control over any of it. She could command servants, wear expensive clothing, and live in luxury, but she couldn't make independent financial decisions, or even keep personal money without her husband's approval. She was simultaneously wealthy and economically powerless. Margot had very little money, but much more economic agency. She could sell eggs at market, trade vegetables with neighbours, save money from spinning wool, and make independent decisions about small purchases that affected her family's daily life. She was poor but economically active in ways that gave her genuine autonomy and decision-making power. The aging process created different challenges for women across class lines. Noble women like Isabel became completely useless to their families once they passed childbearing age. They had no practical skills, no economic function, and no political value. Many noble widows faced poverty and abandonment when their husbands died, and their sons inherited everything. Peasant women like Margot often gained authority and respect as they aged. Their accumulated knowledge about farming, healing, midwifery, and household management made them valuable community resources. Many peasant women became informal leaders in their villages, advising younger families and serving as repositories of practical wisdom that kept their communities functioning. Have you ever wondered which type of marriage gave medieval women more opportunities for genuine happiness? The answer might surprise you. While both systems were oppressive by modern standards, the evidence suggests that peasant women found more satisfaction in their marriages because those relationships were based on genuine partnership and shared challenges, rather than political convenience and economic calculation. Medieval church records actually show lower rates of marriage complaints from peasant women compared to noble women, despite peasant marriages involving much harder physical conditions. The complaints that peasant women brought to church courts were typically about husbands who failed to work hard enough or contribute fairly to family survival. Noble women's complaints were more often about emotional neglect, forced political decisions, and complete powerlessness over their own lives. Think about this. In our modern world, we often assume that wealth and social status automatically translate to better life experiences, but these medieval marriage experiences suggest that autonomy, partnership, and genuine usefulness might matter more for human happiness than luxury and social prestige. The class differences in medieval marriage created completely different definitions of female success, different relationships with power, different opportunities for emotional connection, and different paths through the challenges of being a woman in a male-dominated society. These weren't just economic differences, they were entirely different ways of being human. But regardless of their social class, all medieval women faced one universal challenge that united them across every divide. the complex legal and financial negotiations that determined how their marriages would be structured, what rights they would have, and what would happen to their property, their children, and their lives if those marriages ended. Coming up next, we're diving into the medieval equivalent of prenuptial agreements. Legal documents so complex and comprehensive, they make modern legal contracts look simple by comparison. These weren't just marriage arrangements, they were sophisticated legal instruments that could determine the fate of entire kingdoms and the lives of countless people for generations to come. Whether you were born in a castle or a hovel, every medieval marriage, from the grandest royal alliance to the simplest peasant union, required one thing that would make modern lawyers weep with envy: a marriage contract so detailed, comprehensive, and legally binding that it made today's prenuptial agreements look like grocery lists. These weren't just documents about who got the silverware if things went wrong. These were intricate legal instruments that could reshape kingdoms, start wars, and determine the fate of millions of people for centuries to come. Let me show you the most consequential marriage contract in medieval history, one that literally changed the map of Europe and still affects international politics today. In 1152, Eleanor of Aquitaine's marriage contract with Louis VII of France was dissolved, and she immediately married Henry II of England. The prenuptial agreement for this second marriage transferred control of nearly half of modern-day France from French to English rule, setting up the 100 Years' War and fundamentally altering European civilization. One woman's marriage contract sparked over a century of warfare that killed millions of people. But here's what makes medieval marriage contracts so fascinating. They weren't just legal documents. They were essentially comprehensive life insurance policies, business partnership agreements, international treaties, inheritance planning documents, and military alliance contracts all rolled into one impossibly complex legal instrument. The average noble marriage contract in the 13th century contained over 200 specific clauses, covering everything from bedroom etiquette to what would happen if either spouse was accused of witchcraft. Medieval legal archives contain marriage contracts so detailed they specify which prayers the couple must say together daily, what happens if the wife gives birth to twins, who inherits if both spouses die simultaneously in a plague, and even which spouse has authority over household pets. The 1284 marriage contract between Margaret of Scotland and Eric II of Norway includes a clause specifying that if Margaret dies before producing an heir, Norway must return not only her dowry, but also pay compensation for wasted political expectations. They literally had penalty clauses for failing to reproduce successfully. The most shocking aspect of these contracts was how they treated women's bodies as state assets, with detailed maintenance requirements. The famous marriage contract between Blanche of Castile and Louis VI of France contains clauses requiring Louis to ensure Blanche receives appropriate nutrition for optimal breeding capacity, medical attention from the kingdom's best physicians during pregnancies, and protection from excessive physical exertion that might compromise reproductive function. She wasn't just marrying a man, she was agreeing to become a carefully maintained baby-making machine with specific performance expectations. But medieval marriage contracts also contained surprisingly progressive clauses that protected women in ways that modern agreements often don't. Many contracts included escape clauses that allowed wives to return to their families if husbands failed to meet specific behavioural standards. The 1298 marriage contract between Isabella of Mar and Robert the Bruce actually specifies that if Robert strikes his wife in anger more than thrice in 1 year, Isabella can dissolve the marriage and keep her entire dowry, plus additional compensation for damaged honour. Have you ever wondered what happened when medieval couples wanted to modify their marriage contracts after the wedding? The legal process was incredibly complex and often involved international negotiations. When Philip Augustus of France wanted to change his marriage contract with Ingeborg of Denmark to allow him to remarry, the negotiations took 7 years and involved the Pope, the Holy Roman Emperor, and representatives from 6 different kingdoms. Medieval divorce wasn't just personal, it was international diplomacy. The financial complexity of these contracts was staggering. Medieval marriage agreements didn't just transfer money, they created elaborate financial instruments that could generate income for decades. Eleanor of Provence's 1236 marriage contract with Henry III of England established a dowry payment system that included annual payments of 500 marks for 20 years, plus 10% of all customs revenues from English ports, plus ownership of specific wool-producing estates in Yorkshire. Her marriage contract was essentially a diversified investment portfolio designed to ensure long-term financial security. Medieval contracts also addressed scenarios that revealed just how dangerous life was for married couples. Many agreements included detailed succession plans for what would happen if the husband died in battle, the wife died in childbirth, or both spouses died in epidemics. The marriage contract between Joan of England and William II of Sicily includes specific instructions for what their children should be named if both parents die, who should raise those children, and how the children's education should be managed by designated guardians. But perhaps most remarkably, medieval marriage contracts often functioned as international intelligence agreements. Many contracts included clauses requiring spouses to share military information, report on political developments in their birth family's territories, and even serve as diplomatic messengers between their husbands' and fathers' courts. Medieval wives were often literally contractually obligated to serve as spies for their husbands' political interests. The most elaborate medieval marriage contract ever documented was the 1469 agreement between Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon. Yes, the same couple who would later sponsor Christopher Columbus. Their marriage contract was actually 5 separate documents totaling over 400 pages of legal text. It established not just the terms of their personal marriage, but created the legal framework for unifying Spain, outlined the structure of the Spanish Inquisition, and included preliminary plans for New World exploration and colonization. Their prenup literally laid the groundwork for the Spanish Empire. Medieval marriage contracts reveal fascinating insights into contemporary beliefs about gender roles and capabilities. Many contracts included clauses recognizing that wives might need to rule independently if their husbands were captured in wars or away on crusades. These regency clauses granted women temporary but comprehensive political authority, including the right to command armies, make treaties, and impose taxes. Medieval society simultaneously treated women as property and recognized that they might need to function as independent political leaders. The enforcement mechanisms for these contracts were sophisticated and ruthless. Violation of marriage contract terms could result in excommunication, military invasion, economic sanctions, or diplomatic isolation. When Alfonso X of Castile violated terms of his marriage contract with Violent of Aragon by taking a mistress, Aragon's response included cutting off grain exports to Castile and forming military alliances with Castile's enemies. Medieval marriage contract disputes could literally starve entire populations. Some medieval marriage contracts included clauses that seem almost modern in their attention to emotional well-being and personal compatibility. The 1325 marriage contract between Charles IV of France and Blanche of Burgundy specifies that the couple must spend private time together weekly for the cultivation of marital affection, and includes provisions for marriage counselling from designated church officials if the couple reports relationship difficulties. They recognised that even arranged marriages needed emotional maintenance to function effectively. The geographic variations in marriage contract traditions were enormous, and reflect different cultural priorities across medieval Europe. Northern European contracts focused heavily on military alliance terms and property management, while Mediterranean contracts emphasized trade relationships and commercial partnerships. Scandinavian contracts often included detailed clauses about managing household during long absences for raiding or trading expeditions, while English contracts were obsessed with inheritance law and bloodline legitimacy. Medieval marriage contracts also had to account for religious restrictions and possibilities that created unique legal challenges. Many contracts included clauses specifying what would happen if either spouse decided to take religious vows, if the marriage was declared invalid due to previously unknown blood relationships, or if one spouse was accused of heresy. The 1301 marriage contract between Wenceslaus II of Bohemia and Elizabeth Rycheza of Poland includes a full page dedicated to procedures for handling accusations of witchcraft against either party. What's most remarkable about these medieval marriage contracts is how they balanced detailed practical considerations with acknowledgement of unpredictable human realities. They attempted to create legal frameworks comprehensive enough to handle any conceivable situation, while recognizing that human relationships couldn't be completely controlled through legal documentation. Think about this. Modern prenuptial agreements typically focus on financial arrangements and property division in case of divorce. Medieval marriage contracts addressed not just personal relationships, but international politics, military strategy, economic policy, religious obligations, and dynastic planning. These couples weren't just getting married, they were creating legal frameworks that could affect the lives of millions of people across multiple generations. The legacy of medieval marriage contracts can be seen in how they established precedents for international law, property rights, and governmental structure that persisted for centuries. Many principles embedded in these personal marriage agreements eventually became foundational elements of modern legal systems, constitutional law, and diplomatic protocols. But all of these elaborate legal preparations and contractual safeguards couldn't address one of the most fundamental questions facing medieval couples. What happened when the bride in question had already been married before? The social, legal, and economic implications of remarriage created an entirely separate set of challenges that medieval society handled through a complex hierarchy system that determined a woman's value and social status based on her previous marital experience. Coming up next, we're exploring how medieval society ranked women according to their sexual and marital history, and how this ranking system affected everything from their marriage prospects to their legal rights to their chances of survival in a world that was often brutally unforgiving to women who didn't fit neat social categories. All those intricate marriage contracts we just explored had to navigate one of medieval society's most ruthless classification systems, the hierarchy that ranked women based on their previous sexual and marital experience. This wasn't just social prejudice. This was a comprehensive legal and economic framework that determined a woman's value, rights, and survival chances based on whether she was a virgin, a widow, or something in between. What you're about to discover is that medieval society created essentially different categories of human being based on women's relationship history, with consequences so severe they could mean the difference between prosperity and destitution, respect and exile, or even life and death. At the top of this hierarchy sat the virgin bride, but not just any virgin. The primo nubile, or first-time bride from a noble family, represented the highest possible value in medieval marriage markets. These women commanded premium dowries, had access to the best marriage prospects, and enjoyed maximum legal protections under medieval law. But here's what's shocking. Maintaining virgin status until marriage required such extreme measures that it often damaged women's physical and psychological health permanently. Meet Constance of Brittany, who was kept in literal isolation from age 12 to 18 to preserve her virgin status for political marriage. Her father employed female guards who monitored her every movement, restricted her diet to foods believed to suppress sexual desires, and required her to undergo monthly physical examinations by physicians to verify her continued virginity. When she finally married Geoffrey II of Brittany in 1181, court records describe her as pale, weak, and unfamiliar with common social interactions due to prolonged isolation. The very measures designed to maximize her marriage value had made her almost incapable of normal human relationships. But virgin brides faced their own unique dangers that revealed just how twisted medieval priorities were, because their value was entirely dependent on their unverified sexual status. Virgin brides were vulnerable to false accusations that could destroy their prospects instantly. The famous case of Agnes of Poitou shows how quickly virgin status could be weaponized against women. In 1152, rival families spread rumors that Agnes had been compromised by a stable boy. Even though the accusations were completely fabricated, her dowry value dropped by 75%, and her family struggled for years to arrange any marriage at all. One malicious rumour could transform a premium bride into damaged goods overnight. Medieval medical texts reveal the disturbing lengths families went to verify and maintain their daughter's virginity. The Trotula medical manuscript from 12th century Salerno contains detailed instructions for restoring the appearance of virginity, using various herbs, surgical procedures, and deceptive techniques. Yes, medieval families were performing cosmetic surgery and using primitive medical interventions to fake their daughter's virgin status when political necessity demanded it. But here's where the hierarchy gets truly complex. Widows occupied a completely different category that came with surprising advantages alongside obvious disadvantages. Unlike virgin brides, widows had legal rights, property ownership experience, and social autonomy that made them attractive marriage partners for different reasons. Medieval legal codes recognized widows as femmes sole, women who could own property, make contracts, and operate businesses independently. This legal status made wealthy widows some of the most powerful people in medieval society. Consider the remarkable story of Adela of Blois, who was widowed at age 35 in 1102 when her husband Stephen died during the First Crusade. Instead of quickly remarrying as medieval society expected, Adela spent the next 16 years ruling her deceased husband's territories, commanding armies, negotiating with kings, and accumulating wealth and power that made her one of the most influential people in Western Europe. When she finally chose to remarry in 1118, she negotiated marriage terms from a position of strength that would have been impossible for a virgin bride. The economic realities of widow remarriage were fascinating and counterintuitive. While widows couldn't command the premium dowries that virgin brides received, they often brought more valuable assets to marriages: established businesses, proven fertility, political connections, and most importantly, experience managing households and estates. Medieval account books show that marriages to wealthy widows were often more profitable than marriages to virgin brides, because widows came with immediate practical value rather than just potential future benefits. But medieval society also created a subcategory that reveals just how obsessed they were with controlling women's sexuality. The honest widow versus the suspect widow. Honest widows were those whose husbands had died in battle, from illness, or from old age. Deaths that reflected no negative judgment on the woman's character. Suspect widows were those whose husbands had died under circumstances that suggested possible female involvement, poisoning, accidents, or mysterious illnesses. Even if no formal accusations were made, suspect widows faced significant social stigma and reduced marriage prospects. The time limits for acceptable widowhood were strictly regulated and reveal medieval society's deep discomfort with female sexual autonomy. Canon law required widows to observe mourning periods of 1 to 3 years depending on their social status, during which remarriage was forbidden. But practical politics often overruled religious requirements. If a widow controlled strategically important territories, political pressure for quick remarriage could be intense. Medieval chronicles describe widows being pressured into new marriages within weeks of their husbands' deaths, when military or political circumstances demanded immediate alliance restructuring. Have you ever wondered what happened to women who fell outside these neat categories? Medieval society had to develop frameworks for handling divorced women, women whose marriages had been annulled, and women who had been married multiple times. These women occupied an ambiguous legal and social space that medieval law struggled to address consistently. The most complex cases involved women whose first marriages had been annulled for non-consummation. Technically, these women remained virgins, but they carried the social stigma of failed marriage negotiations. Medieval legal documents describe these women as quasi-virgins, a category that entitled them to some virgin bride privileges, but at significantly reduced rates. The 1299 case of Matilda Flanders, whose first marriage was annulled after 3 years due to her husband's impotence, shows how complicated these situations could become. Her second marriage negotiations took 5 years because families couldn't agree on whether she should be treated as a virgin or a remarrying woman. The hierarchy also had to account for women whose husbands had been declared dead, but later returned from crusades or other long absences. Medieval law developed the concept of presumptive widowhood for women whose husbands had been missing for more than 7 years. If these women remarried and their first husbands returned, complex legal battles ensued over which marriage was valid, what property belonged to whom, and what status the women retained. The famous case of Isabella de Fortibus, who remarried after her husband was presumed dead in the Holy Land only to have him return 12 years later, resulted in legal proceedings that lasted 15 years and involved courts in 3 different countries. Regional variations in how these hierarchies functioned reveal fascinating cultural differences across medieval Europe. In Mediterranean regions influenced by Islamic law, widow remarriage was more socially acceptable and legally protected. Northern European societies were more restrictive about widow autonomy, but offered stronger property protections. Scandinavian cultures allowed more flexibility in marriage dissolution and remarriage, while Celtic regions maintained older traditions that gave women more independence regardless of marital status. The economic data about remarriage patterns shows how these hierarchies functioned in practice. Medieval tax records indicate that approximately 30% of noble widows remarried within 5 years of their husbands' deaths, but remarriage rates varied dramatically based on age, wealth, and political circumstances. Widows under 30 with substantial property remarried at rates over 70%, while widows over 40 remarried at rates under 15%. The marriage market was brutal in its age discrimination against older women, but perhaps most remarkably, some medieval women found ways to game this hierarchy system to their advantage. Wealthy widows would sometimes enter into secret marriage contracts that preserved their legal independence while providing companionship and political alliances. These private marriages weren't legally recognized but allowed women to maintain their valuable widow status while gaining the benefits of partnership. Medieval court records contain fascinating examples of women who maintained official widow status for decades while living in essentially married relationships that served their political and personal needs. The psychological impact of this hierarchy system on medieval women was severe and long-lasting. Women internalized these value rankings and often saw their own worth as fundamentally tied to their sexual and marital history. Medieval personal letters reveal women expressing shame about remarriage, guilt about enjoying widow independence, and anxiety about maintaining virgin status. The system created a form of internalized oppression where women policed their own behavior according to externally imposed value rankings. What's most tragic about this medieval marriage hierarchy is how it reduced women's entire human value to their relationship with men and their sexual history. A woman's intelligence, talents, personality, achievements, or contributions to her community mattered far less than whether she'd been married before, and under what circumstances those relationships had ended. Yet within this oppressive system, we can see the seeds of women's eventual legal and social advancement. The legal rights that widows enjoyed, property ownership, business management, independent decision-making, provided precedents that would eventually expand to include all women. Medieval widows proved that women could handle legal and economic responsibilities successfully, even though society only recognized these capabilities under limited circumstances. Think about this. How much have modern dating and relationship expectations been shaped by these medieval ideas about women's value being tied to their sexual and relationship history? While we've legally abandoned most of these hierarchies, the psychological and social echoes persist in ways that might be more influential than we'd like to admit. But all of these complex social hierarchies and legal frameworks had to culminate in one moment that would determine the success or failure of all the planning, negotiating and positioning that families had invested in, the wedding ceremony itself. Coming up next, we're diving into the spectacular, overwhelming and sometimes chaotic world of medieval weddings. Celebrations that could last for weeks, bankrupt families, and occasionally trigger international incidents. These weren't just personal celebrations. They were political theatre, economic investment, and social spectacle rolled into elaborate ceremonies that would make modern weddings look like simple backyard parties. After years of negotiations, hierarchy positioning, and complex legal contracts, everything culminated in the most extravagant, exhausting, and sometimes dangerous celebrations medieval Europe had ever seen. These weren't the simple ceremonies we imagine from fairy tales. Medieval noble weddings were multi-day political extravaganzas that could bankrupt kingdoms, trigger diplomatic incidents, and occasionally lead to actual warfare when guest-seating arrangements went wrong. What you're about to discover is that a single medieval wedding could involve more planning, expense, and international coordination than modern nations put into hosting Olympic Games. The most spectacular wedding in medieval history took place in 1468 when Charles the Bold of Burgundy married Margaret of York. The celebration lasted 27 days, involved guests from 14 different kingdoms, required the construction of temporary buildings to house everyone, and cost more than the annual budget of most European countries. The wedding feast alone employed over 2,000 cooks and served an estimated 400,000 individual dishes. To put that in perspective, this one wedding celebration fed more people than lived in most medieval cities. But here's what makes medieval weddings truly astounding. Every single element was choreographed political theatre designed to demonstrate power, wealth, and international connections. The guest list wasn't about personal friendship. It was a carefully calculated display of diplomatic alliances. Seating arrangements required months of negotiation, because the wrong placement could be interpreted as a diplomatic insult that might trigger trade wars or military conflicts. Medieval wedding planners weren't party organisers. They were essentially international relations specialists whose mistakes could reshape European politics. The preparation timeline for major noble weddings was staggering. Planning typically began 18 months in advance. and involved coordinating with suppliers across multiple countries. The 1445 wedding of Margaret of Anjou to Henry VI of England required importing wines from France, spices from Venice, silk from Constantinople, and entertainment from as far away as Spain. Medieval wedding logistics involved more international trade coordination than most modern multinational corporations handle in entire fiscal years. Medieval wedding invitations themselves were works of art and diplomacy that revealed just how seriously these events were taken. Invitations were hand-illuminated manuscripts that could take weeks to create, and the language was carefully crafted to convey precise political messages. The invitation to Isabella of Portugal's 1430 wedding to Philip the Good of Burgundy includes specific phrases designed to flatter each recipient's family history, while subtly indicating their expected level of gift-giving and political support. But the most shocking aspect of medieval wedding celebrations was how they functioned as elaborate economic tournaments, where families competed to demonstrate their wealth through increasingly absurd displays of luxury. At the 1396 wedding of Isabella of Valois to Richard II of England, noble families tried to outdo each other with gift presentations that included live exotic animals, commissioned artworks, and even entire castles transferred as wedding presents. One French duke gifted the couple a fully equipped warship, which seems excessive even by medieval standards. The religious ceremonies themselves were surprisingly brief compared to the celebration surrounding them. The actual wedding mass typically lasted 45 minutes to an hour, but the secular festivities could continue for weeks. Medieval church records show that clergy often complained about being overshadowed by the elaborate entertainment and political maneuvering that dominated these events. The spiritual significance of marriage was often completely lost in the spectacle of international showmanship. Have you ever wondered what medieval wedding entertainment actually looked like? It was far more elaborate and expensive than modern destination weddings. The 1477 wedding of Maximilian of Austria to Mary of Burgundy featured professional entertainers imported from across Europe, Italian acrobats, Spanish dancers, French musicians, German storytellers, and English theatrical troupes. They essentially created temporary international arts festivals that showcased the cultural diversity of medieval Europe, while demonstrating the host's ability to coordinate complex international logistics. Medieval wedding fashion was a form of economic warfare where families bankrupted themselves trying to demonstrate superior wealth through increasingly elaborate clothing. Wedding garments were often more valuable than houses and were designed to be worn only once before being displayed in family treasuries as symbols of past glory. The wedding dress worn by Anne of Brittany in 1491 was made from cloth of gold, embedded with precious stones, and required 6 seamstresses working full-time for 8 months to complete. The dress was literally worth more than most noble estates. The food service at medieval noble weddings was so elaborate it required its own military-style organisational structure. Wedding feasts were planned like military campaigns, with detailed supply chains, backup provisions for weather delays, and contingency plans for diplomatic incidents that might affect guest attendance. The 1458 wedding feast of Galeazzo Maria Sforza included 28 different courses, each with multiple options, served to over 3,000 guests simultaneously. They were essentially catering operations that surpassed the logistical complexity of feeding entire armies during wartime. But medieval weddings also revealed the brutal social hierarchies that governed every aspect of daily life. Guest seating was determined by intricate protocols that reflected political alliances, family histories, and current diplomatic relationships. Medieval court records contain detailed diagrams showing exactly where each guest should be placed, what food they should be served, and even which direction they should face during different parts of the ceremony. Violating these protocols could trigger international incidents that lasted for generations. The gift-giving traditions at medieval weddings were essentially diplomatic negotiations disguised as celebration. Wedding presents weren't personal tokens of affection. They were carefully calculated political statements that required months of planning and international consultation. The famous wedding gift inventory from Eleanor of Aquitaine's second marriage lists over 400 individual presents, each catalogued with notes about the giver's political motivations and the strategic implications of accepting or rejecting each gift. Medieval wedding celebrations also functioned as massive intelligence-gathering operations, where families could observe their political rivals, assess military capabilities, and gather information about economic resources. Wedding guests were essentially conducting espionage while participating in festivities. Medieval diplomatic correspondence includes detailed reports that nobles sent to their home governments after attending weddings, describing everything from military equipment displays to overheard conversations about political plans. The transportation logistics for major medieval weddings were mind-boggling and often more complex than military campaigns. Getting hundreds of noble guests from across Europe to wedding locations required coordinating ship schedules, securing safe passage through multiple territories, and arranging lodging in regions that might not have sufficient accommodations. The 1420 wedding of Catherine of Valois to Henry V of England required establishing temporary diplomatic treaties with several kingdoms just to ensure safe travel for wedding guests. But perhaps most remarkably, medieval weddings served as international trade fairs where merchants, artisans, and diplomats could conduct business under the protection of wedding hospitality traditions. Wedding celebrations created temporary zones of diplomatic immunity where enemies could negotiate safely and rival kingdoms could arrange trade deals without losing face. Many important medieval treaties were actually negotiated during wedding festivities, when political rivals were forced to interact in social settings. The documentation of medieval weddings reveals fascinating insights into contemporary values and priorities. Wedding chronicles were often more detailed than military campaign records, and were preserved as family treasures that demonstrated past glory and political connections. These documents show that medieval families considered wedding celebrations more important for their legacy and reputation than military victories or economic achievements. The costs of medieval noble weddings were so extreme, they often required special taxation or borrowing that affected entire kingdoms. The 1396 wedding of Isabella of Valois required the French crown to impose temporary taxes on grain exports to fund the celebration. One wedding celebration literally changed the economic policies of an entire nation and affected the daily lives of millions of people who had no connection to the marriage itself. Regional variations in wedding traditions reveal fascinating cultural differences across medieval Europe. Northern European weddings emphasized military displays and hunting competitions, while Mediterranean weddings focused on artistic performances and intellectual discussions. Scandinavian wedding celebrations often lasted longer but were less expensive, while English weddings were shorter but more politically significant. These differences reflect deeper cultural values about power, wealth, and social relationships. What's most remarkable about medieval wedding spectacles is how they balanced genuine celebration with ruthless political calculation. These events were simultaneously expressions of joy and displays of power, personal milestones and international diplomacy, religious ceremonies and economic warfare. Medieval families managed to create celebrations that served multiple competing purposes, while maintaining the appearance of pure festivity and happiness. Think about this. Modern weddings, even the most elaborate ones, typically focus on the couple's personal preferences and the celebration of their relationship. Medieval weddings were designed to serve family political interests, demonstrate international connections, and establish social hierarchies. The actual couple getting married were often secondary considerations in celebrations that were fundamentally about everything except their personal happiness. But after all the spectacular celebration, international diplomacy and political theatre, the medieval wedding couple faced the one aspect of their new relationship that no amount of planning, negotiation, or public ceremony could fully prepare them for. When the last guest departed and the elaborate festivities ended, these young people, often still teenagers who barely knew each other, were left alone to navigate the most intimate and potentially traumatic aspect of their arranged marriages. Coming up next, we're exploring the medieval wedding night, and what you're about to learn about medieval beliefs, expectations, and practices surrounding consummation will reveal just how different these experiences were from anything we can imagine today. When the last wedding guest finally departed and the elaborate celebrations ended, the young bride and groom faced something that no amount of political planning or international diplomacy could have prepared them for: their first night alone together as husband and wife. What happened next wasn't the romantic fairy tale ending we might imagine. Medieval wedding nights were governed by a complex web of religious doctrine, medical misinformation, and social expectations so twisted and terrifying that they often traumatized both spouses and set the tone for relationships that might last 50 years or more. The medieval church had very specific and very disturbing teachings about what should happen on wedding nights. Canon law required marriages to be consummated within 3 days of the ceremony, but simultaneously taught that sexual pleasure was sinful even within marriage. This created an impossible psychological situation where couples were legally required to engage in an act that the church simultaneously declared morally dangerous. Medieval religious texts actually contained detailed instructions for achieving conception while minimizing the sinful pleasure that might occur during the process. Let me tell you about the wedding night preparation that medieval brides received, because it reveals just how traumatic these experiences were designed to be. Noble girls like Joan of Navarre, who married Philip IV of France in 1284, underwent what was called marital instruction on their wedding day. This wasn't education about intimacy or emotional connection. This was essentially preparation for what medieval society considered a necessary ordeal that women had to endure for political and religious purposes. Medieval medical texts contain the most disturbing advice for wedding night success that you can imagine. The influential physician Avicenna's medical manuscript, widely used across Europe, recommended that brides drink wine mixed with ground pearls to ease the pain of marital duty, and suggested that grooms consume various animal parts to increase their masculine vigour. These weren't folk remedies. These were the official medical recommendations that educated families followed for their children's wedding nights. But here's what's most shocking about medieval wedding night beliefs. They were based on medical theories so completely wrong that they actually endangered both spouses' health and emotional well-being. Medieval physicians believed that women's bodies were essentially defective versions of men's bodies, and that female sexual anatomy was designed to be painful and dangerous during intercourse. They taught that women who experienced any pleasure during sex would produce malformed children, and that excessive enjoyment could cause permanent physical damage to a woman's reproductive system. The religious preparations for wedding nights were equally disturbing and reveal how the medieval church viewed female sexuality as fundamentally threatening. Brides were required to confess all their sexual thoughts, even involuntary ones, before their wedding nights, and receive special absolution for the sin they were about to commit with their husbands. Medieval confession manuals actually contained detailed questions that priests were supposed to ask brides about their sexual fears and curiosities, treating normal human emotions as evidence of moral corruption. Medieval wedding night traditions included practices that would be considered psychological torture by modern standards. In many noble families, the bride's female relatives would remain nearby during consummation to verify that the marriage had been properly completed. Some families required physical evidence of virginity to be displayed the morning after, and brides who couldn't provide such proof faced accusations of fraud that could annul the marriage and destroy their family's political alliances. Have you ever wondered what medieval medical authorities thought would happen if wedding night consummation was delayed or unsuccessful? Their theories were absolutely bizarre and reveal the extent of medieval ignorance about human sexuality. Medical texts taught that unconsummated marriages could cause women to develop wandering womb syndrome, a condition where the uterus supposedly moved around inside the body, causing insanity. They also believed that men who didn't consummate their marriages quickly would develop seed poisoning that could be fatal if not treated immediately. The age differences in medieval marriages made wedding nights even more traumatic and problematic. When 14-year-old Isabel of Angoulême married the significantly older King John of England in 1200, medieval chroniclers actually recorded details about their wedding night that reveal the brutal reality of these arranged unions. The bride was described as terrified and weeping, while the groom was praised for his patience and gentleness, a description that suggests the bar for acceptable behaviour was horrifyingly low. Medieval marriage manuals contain advice for grooms that shows how these encounters were viewed more as military conquest than intimate relationships. The influential text Secretum Secretorum advises grooms to approach their wedding night duties as a knight approaches battle, with courage, determination, and divine blessing. It literally compares sexual intimacy to warfare and suggests that successful consummation requires the same mindset as military victory. But perhaps most heartbreaking are the personal accounts that survive from medieval brides describing their wedding night experiences. A letter from Marguerite of Provence, written to her sister after her marriage to Louis IX of France in 1234, describes feeling as though I had died and been reborn as a different person after her wedding night. She writes about losing her identity and becoming merely a vessel for his family's future. These weren't just physical traumas, they were complete psychological transformations that changed young women's sense of self permanently. The medical complications from medieval wedding night practices were severe and often life-threatening. Medieval physicians had no understanding of female anatomy, proper preparation for sexual intimacy, or basic concepts of consent and comfort. Court records contain numerous cases of brides suffering serious injuries during wedding night consummation that required months of medical treatment and sometimes resulted in permanent disability or death. Medieval society also created elaborate rituals around proving that wedding night consummation had occurred successfully. Noble families would sometimes require witnesses to remain outside the bridal chamber and report on sounds that indicated the marriage had been completed. Some families employed professional wedding night verifiers, usually older women who had examined both the bride and groom the morning after, to confirm that consummation had taken place according to legal and religious requirements. The psychological preparation that medieval grooms received was almost as problematic as what brides experienced. Young men were taught that their wedding night performance would determine their masculinity, political power, and divine favour for the rest of their lives. Medieval texts contain detailed instructions for grooms about how to overcome nervousness, demonstrate dominance, and ensure conception while avoiding the sin of excessive pleasure. The pressure on young men to perform according to these impossible standards often resulted in dysfunction and violence that affected marriages for decades. Regional variations in wedding night customs reveal fascinating and disturbing cultural differences across medieval Europe. In some Germanic traditions, Wedding nights were delayed until the bride had been seasoned through exposure to her new household for several months. Mediterranean customs emphasized immediate consummation, but included elaborate rituals designed to ensure fertility. Celtic traditions maintained older practices that gave brides more agency, but these were gradually suppressed by Christian influence. The documentation of wedding night success or failure was considered so important that medieval families maintained detailed records that served as legal evidence in potential annulment proceedings. These records sometimes included intimate details about the couple's sexual compatibility, physical characteristics, and conception timing that would be considered shocking invasions of privacy by any modern standard. What's most tragic about medieval wedding night practices is how they established patterns of trauma and dysfunction that affected not just the wedding night itself, but the entire course of marriages that might last 50 years or more. Many medieval couples never recovered from the psychological damage of their first intimate encounter, creating relationships based on fear, resentment, and duty rather than any possibility of affection or mutual respect. Medieval medical texts also contain disturbing advice for dealing with brides who were resistant to wedding night consummation. Physicians recommended various herbs, physical restraints, and even threats that were designed to overcome a bride's natural fears and ensure that marriages were completed according to legal requirements. These weren't fringe practices. These were mainstream medical recommendations that educated families followed routinely. The long-term effects of traumatic wedding night experiences can be seen in medieval court records documenting marriage problems, domestic violence, and mental health issues that plagued noble families for generations. Many of the marital difficulties we've discussed throughout this series can be traced directly to the psychological damage inflicted during couples' first intimate encounters. Think about this. Medieval society invested enormous resources in wedding celebrations, legal contracts, and political negotiations, but completely failed to prepare couples for the emotional and physical realities of intimate relationships. They treated human sexuality with such ignorance and superstition that they systematically traumatized the very people whose happiness and compatibility were essential for the political alliances they were trying to create. But all of this trauma, ignorance, and dysfunction surrounding wedding night consummation was just the beginning of medieval couples' challenges. Once marriages were legally established through consummation, wives faced immediate and intense pressure to prove their value through the one contribution that medieval society considered most important: producing male heirs who could continue family bloodlines and political alliances. Coming up next, we're exploring how medieval wives were transformed from wedding day brides into what amounted to professional baby-making machines, under constant surveillance and pressure to conceive, carry, and deliver the sons that their families' futures depended upon. The medical ignorance and social expectations surrounding pregnancy and childbirth were even more dangerous than the wedding night terrors we just discussed. Once the wedding night ordeal was over and marriage had been legally consummated, medieval wives faced a pressure that made all the previous challenges seem minor by comparison. The immediate, relentless, and potentially life-threatening expectation to produce male heirs. What happened next wasn't gradual adjustment to married life or time to develop relationships with their new husbands. Medieval wives were instantly transformed into what amounted to professional reproduction machines, monitored constantly, medically manipulated, and valued solely for their ability to deliver sons who could continue family bloodlines and secure political alliances. The timeline for pregnancy expectations was shockingly immediate and reveals just how little medieval society cared about women's physical or emotional well-being. Most noble families expected confirmation of pregnancy within the first 3 months of marriage, and failure to conceive quickly was treated as a potential political crisis. When Berenguela of Castile married Alfonso IX of Leon in 1197, her failure to show signs of pregnancy within 6 months triggered such concern that both families consulted physicians, astronomers, and religious authorities to determine whether the marriage was cursed or the bride was defective. Medieval medical treatment for fertility was a nightmare combination of ignorance, superstition, and practices that often did more harm than good. The most influential medical text of the era, Constantine the African's Pantegni, recommended treatments for infertility that included forcing women to drink mixtures containing ground animal organs, herbs that we now know are toxic, and metals like mercury that could cause permanent brain damage. These weren't folk remedies. These were the official medical recommendations that wealthy families paid substantial sums to implement. But here's what's most disturbing about medieval pregnancy pressure. It was applied not just by husbands and in-laws, but by entire networks of political allies whose own interests depended on successful heir production. When Isabella of Jerusalem married Frederick II, Holy Roman Emperor, in 1225, her pregnancy became a matter of international concern involving the Pope, multiple kingdoms, and trading partners across Europe. Her monthly menstrual cycles were literally monitored by diplomatic representatives who reported to their home governments about the likelihood of pregnancy. The surveillance of pregnant medieval wives was comprehensive and invasive in ways that would be considered medical abuse by modern standards. Noble pregnant women were assigned teams of physicians, midwives, and female attendants, whose job was to monitor every aspect of their daily lives: diet, exercise, emotional state, sleep patterns, and even their thoughts and dreams. Medieval medical texts contained detailed schedules for pregnant noble women that regulated everything from when they could bathe to which prayers they should recite to ensure healthy male children. Medieval beliefs about pregnancy and fetal development were so scientifically wrong, they actively endangered both mothers and babies. Physicians taught that a pregnant woman's thoughts and experiences would directly affect her child's character and abilities. This meant that pregnant noble women were essentially prisoners in carefully controlled environments, designed to ensure they only encountered influences that would create ideal heirs. They were forbidden from seeing disabled people, exposed only to beautiful art and music, and required to focus their thoughts constantly on masculine virtues they wanted their sons to possess. Have you ever wondered what happened to medieval wives who suffered miscarriages or delivered stillborn children? The consequences were devastating and revealed just how little value medieval society placed on women's emotional well-being. Miscarriage was often treated as evidence of moral failing, divine punishment, or even witchcraft. When Clemence of Hungary lost 3 pregnancies in succession during her marriage to Louis XI of France, she faced accusations of being cursed, physically defective, or secretly practicing birth control, all of which could have resulted in annulment, exile, or worse. The pressure to produce specifically male heirs created additional psychological torture for medieval wives. Giving birth to daughters was considered partial failure that increased pressure for future pregnancies. Medieval court records show that women who delivered multiple daughters in succession faced increasing isolation, reduced household authority, and sometimes threats of divorce or annulment. The famous case of Eleanor of Aquitaine, who gave birth to 3 daughters before finally producing a son, shows how even the most powerful women faced criticism and political vulnerability based on their children's gender. Medieval childbirth itself was a medical nightmare that combined dangerous ignorance with religious superstition in ways that killed both mothers and babies at horrifying rates. Maternal mortality rates among medieval noble women were approximately 20%, meaning 1 in 5 women died during or shortly after childbirth. But instead of developing better medical practices, medieval physicians blamed high death rates on women's moral failings insufficient faith, or failure to follow increasingly bizarre medical recommendations. The medical treatments applied to pregnant medieval women were often more dangerous than the pregnancy itself. Physicians routinely performed bloodletting on pregnant women to balance their humours, prescribed medications containing known toxins, and recommended physical activities that increased miscarriage risks. The influential physician Trotula's medical texts recommend treatments for pregnancy complications that include applying hot irons to women's backs, forcing them to inhale toxic fumes, and feeding them substances that we now know cause birth defects. But perhaps most heartbreaking are the personal accounts from medieval women describing the psychological toll of constant pregnancy pressure. A letter from Marguerite of Provence to her confessor, written during her fourth pregnancy, describes feeling like a vessel that exists only to be filled and emptied according to others' needs. She writes about losing her sense of identity and becoming merely a container for the hopes and fears of people who barely know my name. These women understood exactly what was happening to them but were powerless to change their circumstances. The economic calculations around pregnancy and childbirth reveal how completely medieval families commodified women's reproductive capacity. Noble families would calculate the investment value of pregnant wives based on the likelihood of successful male heir production, and these calculations affected everything from medical care to household status to inheritance planning. Medieval account books actually contain line items for pregnancy maintenance costs and heir production expenses that treat women's bodies like expensive equipment, requiring careful maintenance to ensure optimal performance. Regional variations in pregnancy treatment show fascinating cultural differences but universally dangerous medical practices. Northern European families emphasized physical restrictions and dietary controls, while Mediterranean families focused more on astrological timing and religious rituals. But regardless of regional differences, all medieval pregnancy management was based on fundamentally wrong understanding of female biology and fetal development that endangered both mothers and children. Medieval society also developed elaborate rituals around predicting and ensuring the gender of unborn children that reveal their obsession with male heir production. Pregnant noble women were subjected to various gender determination procedures that included examining their urine colour, monitoring their food cravings, observing their physical appearance changes, and even analysing their dreams for clues about their baby's gender. When these predictions suggested female babies, families would implement additional treatments designed to transform the fetus into a male heir. The social isolation of pregnant medieval wives was systematic and cruel. To protect their pregnancies from evil influences, noble women were often confined to their chambers for months, forbidden from participating in social activities, and restricted from seeing most family members. This isolation was justified as medical necessity, but functioned as psychological torture that left women completely dependent on their captors for human contact and emotional support. Medieval medical texts contain disturbing advice for managing pregnant women's emotional states that shows how little regard medieval society had for women's mental health. Physicians recommended that pregnant women be kept in cheerful ignorance about family problems, political difficulties, or any information that might cause stress. This meant that pregnant noble women were often completely uninformed about major events affecting their own families and kingdoms while they were carrying potential heirs. The documentation of pregnancy outcomes was obsessive and detailed, because these records served as legal evidence in inheritance disputes and political negotiations. Medieval families maintained comprehensive records of pregnancy symptoms, labour duration, birth complications, and infant characteristics that would be used to verify legitimacy and inheritance rights for decades. These records show that women's most intimate biological experiences were treated as public information that could affect international politics. What's most tragic about medieval pregnancy pressure is how it eliminated any possibility for women to develop relationships with their own children. Medieval noble mothers were typically separated from their babies immediately after birth and had minimal contact during early childhood. Their value was measured by successful delivery, not by their capacity for nurturing or their emotional bonds with their children. They were essentially hired wombs whose job ended when healthy male heirs were produced. Think about this. Medieval society invested enormous resources in monitoring and controlling pregnant women to ensure successful heir production, but their medical ignorance and social priorities actually reduced the chances of healthy births and maternal survival. They created systems designed to optimize reproduction that were fundamentally counterproductive because they were based on completely wrong understanding of human biology and psychology. The psychological and physical trauma of medieval pregnancy management affected not just individual women, but the relationships between mothers and children for generations. Many medieval noble children grew up with mothers who had been so traumatized by pregnancy pressure and childbirth complications that they were incapable of normal emotional connections. The system that was designed to secure family bloodlines often produced dysfunctional family relationships that weakened the very dynasties it was meant to strengthen. But even when medieval wives successfully navigated the dangers of pregnancy and childbirth to produce the male heirs their families demanded, their challenges were far from over. In fact, for many women, successful reproduction marked the beginning of their most vulnerable period, when their political value decreased and their personal autonomy virtually disappeared. Coming up next, we're exploring what happened to medieval wives when their marriages became unbearable, their husbands turned violent, or their political circumstances changed, and how the legal and social systems that governed marriage dissolution were designed to trap women in impossible situations while offering men multiple escape routes. The stories of women who fought for freedom from their marriages will show you just how far some were willing to go to reclaim their lives, even when the consequences could be deadly. For medieval wives who had survived the wedding night trauma, endured years of pregnancy pressure, and found themselves trapped in marriages that had become unbearable, the question of escape presented one of the most dangerous challenges they would ever face. Unlike the systematic oppression we've explored so far, this was where individual women had to make choices that could mean the difference between freedom and death. What you're about to discover is that medieval marriage dissolution wasn't just legally complex. It was a high-stakes game where women had to outmaneuver religious authorities, political networks, and family interests that all had reasons to keep them trapped. The most famous medieval marriage escape belongs to Eleanor of Aquitaine, whose annulment from Louis VII of France in 1152 literally changed the course of European history. But what most people don't know is how close Eleanor came to being murdered for seeking her freedom. Her annulment petition triggered a political crisis that involved the Pope, the Holy Roman Emperor, and threatened to start a war between France and England. Eleanor's escape from her first marriage was so controversial that Louis VII's supporters actually planned to assassinate her during the annulment proceedings to prevent her from remarrying and taking her vast territories to a rival kingdom. Medieval annulment law was deliberately designed to make escape nearly impossible, while appearing to offer legitimate pathways to freedom. The Church recognized only 7 grounds for annulment: non-consummation, blood relationship within prohibited degrees, previous marriage, holy orders, age below consent, coercion, or impotence. But proving any of these grounds required evidence that was often impossible to obtain, and testimony that could be bought, threatened, or manipulated by powerful families with interests in maintaining existing marriages. The most shocking aspect of medieval marriage dissolution was how differently it functioned for men versus women. When men sought annulments, church courts typically processed their cases within months and accepted relatively weak evidence. When women sought annulments, the same courts demanded extraordinary proof, required testimony from multiple witnesses, and often delayed proceedings for years while subjecting the women to investigation, harassment, and sometimes imprisonment. The famous case of Ingeborg of Denmark, whose marriage to Philip Augustus of France was declared invalid after just one day, shows how quickly annulment could work when powerful men wanted freedom. But when Ingeborg tried to fight the annulment to protect her own interests, the legal battle lasted 20 years. Have you ever wondered what happened to medieval women who simply fled their marriages without seeking legal annulment? The consequences were swift and brutal, but some women considered the risks preferable to remaining in abusive or unbearable situations. Medieval law treated wife abandonment as theft of property, and runaway wives could be pursued, captured, and returned to their husbands by force. But the stories of women who successfully escaped reveal sophisticated networks of supporters who helped trapped wives disappear completely. The most elaborate medieval marriage escape I've found involves Constance of Brittany, who in 1196 staged her own death to escape a politically motivated marriage to Ranulph de Blondeville. Constance spent 2 years secretly planning her escape with the help of loyal servants, sympathetic clergy, and even rival political factions who had their own reasons for wanting to disrupt her husband's family alliances. On the night of her supposed death, Constance was actually smuggled out of her castle in a funeral shroud and transported to a monastery where she lived under an assumed identity for 3 years before remarrying under circumstances that legitimized her escape. Medieval women also developed creative legal strategies that exploited loopholes in church law to gain freedom from unwanted marriages. Some women claimed religious vocations that would nullify their marriages, even if they had no intention of actually becoming nuns. Others deliberately provoked their husbands into behavior that could be classified as grounds for annulment. The remarkable case of Marie de Champagne shows how strategically intelligent medieval women could outmaneuver even sophisticated legal opposition when their freedom was at stake. The economic warfare around medieval marriage dissolution was intense, and often more important than the legal proceedings themselves. Divorce and annulment cases frequently involved massive property transfers that could affect entire kingdoms' economic stability. When Eleanor of Aquitaine's annulment was finalised, France lost control of territories that represented nearly 40% of its economic productivity. Medieval families would spend fortunes fighting annulment cases, not because they cared about individual marriages, but because the financial consequences of marriage dissolution could determine their survival for generations. But perhaps most remarkably, some medieval women found ways to escape their marriages while technically remaining married, creating parallel lives that allowed them to function independently while avoiding legal consequences. These married-in-name-only arrangements required extraordinary sophistication and political skill, but they offered options for women whose circumstances made formal annulment impossible or too dangerous to pursue. The geographic variations in annulment law created opportunities for strategic forum shopping that medieval women learned to exploit. Different regions had different requirements for proving annulment grounds, different timelines for processing cases, and different penalties for marriage abandonment. Some women would deliberately relocate to jurisdictions where annulment was easier to obtain, while others would time their escape attempts to coincide with political changes that might make local authorities more sympathetic to their cases. Medieval church records reveal the disturbing extent to which religious authorities collaborated with abusive husbands to prevent women from escaping marriages. Priests would often refuse to accept annulment petitions from women, claim that evidence was insufficient when similar evidence had been accepted in men's cases, and sometimes actively informed husbands when wives were seeking legal advice about marriage dissolution. The Church's official position was that marriage was sacred and indissoluble, but in practice they seemed more concerned with maintaining male authority than protecting the sanctity of the marriage bond. The physical dangers facing women who sought to escape medieval marriages were extreme and often life-threatening. Medieval legal codes allowed husbands to use reasonable force to retrieve runaway wives, and definitions of reasonable force were interpreted very broadly. Court records contain numerous cases of women being severely injured or killed during attempts to escape marriages, and these deaths were rarely prosecuted as crimes because they were considered natural consequences of women's disobedience to legitimate male authority. Some medieval women formed secret networks that functioned like underground railroads for escaping abused wives. These networks included sympathetic clergy, who would provide sanctuary, merchant families who could arrange transportation, and even political rivals who would harbour runaway wives to damage their husband's standing. The existence of these networks shows that medieval society contained people who recognised the injustice of the marriage system and were willing to risk their own safety to help trapped women find freedom. The psychological toll of seeking divorce or annulment in medieval society was severe and long-lasting. Women who challenged their marriages faced social ostracism, religious condemnation, and accusations of moral corruption that could follow them for the rest of their lives. Even women who successfully obtained annulments often found themselves unmarriageable and economically vulnerable, trapped between the marriages they'd escaped and societies that punished them for seeking freedom. Medieval annulment proceedings sometimes revealed shocking secrets about noble families that had been carefully hidden for years. Court records contain testimony about domestic violence, financial fraud, sexual dysfunction, mental illness, and political betrayals that families had concealed to maintain their reputations. Some annulment cases exposed corruption and scandal that destroyed multiple families and reshaped political alliances across entire regions. The role of witnesses in medieval annulment cases was complex and often corrupt. Witnesses could be bribed, threatened, or coerced into providing testimony that supported wealthy families' interests. But some witnesses also showed remarkable courage in providing honest testimony that helped trapped women escape dangerous marriages, even when such testimony put the witnesses themselves at risk of retaliation from powerful families. Think about this. Medieval women seeking to escape their marriages had to navigate legal systems designed to trap them, religious authorities often working against their interests, family networks that prioritized political alliances over individual welfare, and social expectations that treated their desire for freedom as evidence of moral corruption. Yet many women still found ways to escape, often displaying levels of strategic intelligence, personal courage, and political sophistication that challenge every stereotype about medieval women's capabilities and agency. The legal precedents established by successful medieval annulment cases gradually expanded women's rights and created frameworks that would eventually evolve into modern divorce law. Many of the principles we take for granted in contemporary marriage dissolution, the right to legal representation, standards of evidence, protection from domestic violence, can be traced back to medieval women who fought for these protections in their own annulment proceedings. But for all the women who successfully escaped their marriages through legal or extra-legal means, many more remained trapped in situations they couldn't change. The stories of women who found freedom are inspiring, but they also highlight the systematic oppression that made such escapes necessary, and the courage required to challenge social systems that treated women's autonomy as fundamentally threatening to social order. The documentation of medieval marriage dissolution cases provides fascinating insights into contemporary attitudes about gender, power, religion, and law that persisted for centuries. These cases show how individual women's personal struggles became battlegrounds for larger conflicts about male authority, church power, economic control, and social change that shaped European civilization for generations. What's most remarkable about medieval women's efforts to escape marriage is how they had to become experts in law, politics, economics, and strategy just to claim basic human rights that were automatically granted to men. Their success required not just personal courage, but sophisticated understanding of complex systems designed to prevent exactly the outcomes they were seeking. All of these stories of escape, resistance, and legal maneuvering reveal something profound about the human spirit's refusal to accept injustice, even under the most oppressive circumstances. Medieval women's fights for freedom from unbearable marriages establish principles and precedents that continue to influence how we think about personal autonomy, legal rights, and the balance between individual welfare and social stability. Their legacy extends far beyond their own historical moment and connects directly to contemporary struggles for equality, justice, and human dignity that define our modern world. Coming up in our final segment, we'll explore how these medieval marriage practices created lasting influences that echo through centuries to affect the wedding traditions, legal frameworks, and relationship expectations that still shape our lives today. As we reach the end of this extraordinary journey through medieval women's marriage experiences, we arrive at perhaps the most surprising discovery of all: how many of these seemingly ancient practices continue to influence our modern relationships, wedding traditions, and social expectations in ways we rarely recognize or acknowledge. What you're about to learn is that the medieval marriage system didn't simply disappear when the Middle Ages ended. It evolved, adapted, and embedded itself so deeply in Western culture that we're still living with its consequences today, 8 centuries later. Let's start with something you probably participated in recently: a modern wedding ceremony. That beautiful tradition of the bride wearing white. It comes directly from medieval beliefs about virginity as the highest female virtue. The practice of the father giving away the bride represents the literal property transfer that we explored in our very first episode. The exchange of rings symbolizes the binding contracts that once determined women's entire life paths. Even the wedding reception tradition of elaborate gift-giving evolved from the medieval practice of displaying family wealth and political alliances through competitive present exchanges. But here's what's truly shocking. Many aspects of modern relationship economics mirror medieval marriage markets more closely than we'd like to admit. The contemporary emphasis on educational credentials, career prospects, and financial stability in partner selection operates on similar principles to medieval dowry calculations and family alliance strategies. Dating apps that allow users to filter potential partners by income, education level, and social status are essentially digital versions of the marriage broker networks we discussed, complete with detailed databases and strategic matchmaking algorithms. The influence of medieval marriage law on contemporary legal systems is staggering and often invisible. The legal concept of marital property, the presumption of paternal custody rights, the requirement of witnesses for marriage validity, and even the grounds for divorce all trace directly back to medieval canon law and civil regulations we've explored throughout this series. When modern courts make decisions about alimony, child custody, or property division, they're often applying legal principles that were developed to manage the political and economic arrangements of medieval noble families. Have you ever wondered why modern society still places such different expectations on men and women regarding sexual history, relationship experience, and marriage timing? These double standards come directly from the medieval hierarchy system that ranked women based on their previous relationships while allowing men virtually unlimited sexual freedom, the social pressure on women to marry by certain ages, the stigma attached to divorce, and the different ways society judges male versus female promiscuity all reflect medieval value systems that treated women as commodities whose worth decreased with use. But perhaps most remarkably, the psychological patterns we've traced throughout medieval marriages persist in contemporary relationship dynamics in ways that affect millions of people daily. The pressure to perform perfect relationships on social media mirrors the medieval emphasis on marriage as public political theatre rather than private emotional connection. The contemporary phenomenon of elaborate wedding planning that prioritizes spectacle over genuine relationship preparation echoes the medieval practice of investing enormous resources in wedding celebrations while providing no actual education about intimate partnership. Modern reproductive rights debates contain echoes of medieval pregnancy pressure that are both fascinating and disturbing. Contemporary discussions about women's biological clocks, the timing of career versus family decisions, and the social judgment faced by women who choose not to have children all reflect medieval assumptions about women's primary value being tied to their reproductive capacity. Even modern medical approaches to pregnancy often prioritize fetal outcomes over maternal well-being in ways that would be familiar to medieval physicians who treated pregnant women as vessels for heir production. The economic realities of modern marriage still contain elements of the medieval dowry system, though in reversed and updated forms. Contemporary expectations about engagement ring costs, wedding expenses, and the financial responsibilities of different family members during marriage planning all reflect economic calculations about demonstrating family status and commitment that trace back to medieval marriage negotiations. The modern phenomenon of couples going into debt to fund elaborate weddings mirrors the medieval practice of families bankrupting themselves to demonstrate political allegiance and social status. Regional and cultural variations in contemporary marriage practices often reflect medieval traditions that have persisted for centuries. Mediterranean culture's emphasis on family involvement in partner selection, Northern European focus on individual choice and legal independence, and Celtic traditions that preserve women's property rights all demonstrate how medieval regional differences continue to influence modern relationship expectations across different societies. The professional relationship industry, matchmaking services, wedding planners, marriage counselors, and divorce attorneys represents a direct evolution of the medieval marriage broker system we explored. These professionals serve similar functions to their medieval predecessors, navigating complex social and legal systems, managing family expectations, and facilitating relationships that serve multiple competing interests. The sophisticated psychological profiling and compatibility assessment offered by modern dating services mirrors the detailed personality and political analysis that medieval brokers conducted for their clients. But here's what's most important about understanding these connections. Recognizing the medieval origins of contemporary relationship patterns can help us make more conscious choices about which traditions serve our modern values and which perpetuate systems of inequality and oppression that we've supposedly outgrown. Many couples today unknowingly recreate medieval power dynamics in their relationships because they've inherited expectations and assumptions without understanding their historical context. The resistance strategies that medieval women developed continue to inspire contemporary efforts to challenge relationship inequality and expand women's autonomy. The legal precedents established by medieval women who fought for annulments and divorce evolved into modern protections against domestic violence, economic abuse, and reproductive coercion. The networks of support that helped medieval women escape dangerous marriages established patterns of mutual aid, that continue in contemporary domestic violence shelters, legal advocacy organisations, and informal support networks. Think about this. Every time a modern woman negotiates a prenuptial agreement, maintains her career after marriage, or chooses to keep her name, she's exercising freedoms that medieval women fought and sometimes died to establish. The legal rights and social options that contemporary women take for granted represent the accumulated victories of countless medieval women whose names we'll never know, but whose courage expanded the possibilities for all who came after. The economic independence that modern women can achieve through education and career development represents a complete reversal of the medieval system that trapped women in economic dependence on male relatives. Yet contemporary wage gaps, career penalties for motherhood, and the persistent expectation that women will sacrifice professional advancement for family responsibilities show how deeply medieval assumptions about women's proper roles continue to influence modern society. What's fascinating is how medieval marriage practices anticipated many features of contemporary relationship culture that we consider modern innovations. The medieval emphasis on contract negotiations, the detailed documentation of relationship terms, and the involvement of professional intermediaries in partner selection all resemble aspects of modern dating that we think reflect progress rather than return to historical patterns. The psychological insights that emerge from studying medieval marriage experiences offer valuable perspectives on contemporary relationship challenges. Medieval women's strategies for finding agency within oppressive systems, maintaining identity while adapting to social expectations, and building emotional connections despite structural barriers, provide models for navigating modern relationship difficulties that share surprising similarities with medieval challenges. Regional differences in how medieval marriage traditions evolved into modern practices create fascinating variations in contemporary relationship cultures that often puzzle people from different backgrounds. Understanding these historical roots can help modern couples navigate cultural differences in relationship expectations, family involvement, and life transition planning that might otherwise create unnecessary conflict. The documentation practices that medieval families used to record marriage negotiations, relationship milestones, and family histories established patterns of relationship record-keeping that persist in contemporary traditions like wedding photography, anniversary celebrations, and family genealogy research. These practices serve similar functions today that they served in medieval times, creating evidence of legitimate relationships, demonstrating social status, and preserving family narratives for future generations. As we conclude this remarkable journey through medieval women's marriage experiences, the most important lesson might be this: understanding history doesn't just satisfy curiosity about the past, it provides tools for making more conscious choices about the present and future. The medieval women whose stories we've explored faced impossible circumstances with remarkable creativity, courage, and resilience. Their struggles established precedents and possibilities that continue to expand options for everyone seeking authentic relationships, legal equality, and personal autonomy. Their legacy reminds us that social systems that seem permanent and natural are actually constructed and changeable. The marriage practices that shaped medieval society for centuries eventually gave way to different arrangements that better served human flourishing. Contemporary relationship patterns that limit human potential or perpetuate inequality can also evolve when enough people recognize their historical origins and choose to create something better. The journey from medieval marriage to modern relationships represents one of humanity's greatest advances in recognizing individual dignity, expanding personal choice, and creating social systems that serve human happiness rather than just political convenience. Yet this journey is far from complete. and understanding where we've come from helps us navigate where we're going with greater wisdom, compassion, and determination to create relationships and social systems that honor the full humanity of everyone involved. Thank you for joining me on this incredible exploration of how love, power, politics, and human resilience intersected in one of history's most fascinating periods. The stories we've shared tonight remind us that the pursuit of authentic connection and personal freedom is as old as humanity itself, and that each generation has the opportunity to expand the possibilities for those who come after. Sweet dreams, and may your own relationships be blessed with the freedom, respect, and genuine partnership that so many medieval women could only dream of achieving.